Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I remember the first night I spent in that rented house as if it were carved into my memory with a razor blade. Even before the sun went down, the air felt strangely stale and heavy, like every wall was exhaling a musty breath. As I unloaded boxes, an oppressive sensation pressed on my chest, making every breath feel labored. It wasn't fear in the strict sense, more like an unsettling awareness that something in that house watched me from the shadows. The moment I found out there was a small attic overhead, I felt a faint pulse of dread snake through my veins. I tried to dismiss it, thinking maybe I was just tired. But that feeling followed me relentlessly, whispering at the back of my mind that I'd walked into a place harboring secrets best left undiscovered. My decision to move there had been rushed. The place was close to my new job, and the rent was suspiciously cheap for a single-story house in a decent neighborhood. On the day I signed the papers, the landlord offered almost no explanation for the reduced cost. He only mentioned in passing that the house had a storage loft up above, accessible by a fold-down hatch and ladder in the hallway ceiling. I remember him vaguely hinting that previous tenants had complained about sounds up there. He shrugged it off, suggesting raccoons or squirrels. At the time, I had shrugged too, choosing to believe I could handle the occasional critter. I was more concerned with saving money than dealing with rumors. If I heard squeaking or scurrying, I'd set a trap or call pest control. I never imagined anything else might be waiting for me in that cramped, dusty space. Within my first week, I got used to the general layout: a simple living room, a small kitchen, one bedroom, and a modest bathroom. The entire house was old but sturdy enough, with squeaky floorboards and outdated fixtures. Some corners had a faint smell of damp wood, and the overhead lights tended to flicker if I left them on too long. At first, I blamed it all on an outdated electrical system. My biggest concern was the attic. At around midnight every night, I began hearing a sequence of faint, deliberate footsteps above my head. I tried rationalizing these sounds. Perhaps it was just the house settling, or maybe there really were some rodents up there. But these noises had a distinctly human-like rhythm, as if someone was walking barefoot from one end of the attic to the other. I felt my heart race every time I heard them. My breath would catch in my throat, and my palms would start to sweat. Yet I kept telling myself it had to be an animal or the pipes. Still, I couldn't shake the unnerving certainty that someone, or something, was moving around directly above me in the dead of night. On the third night, I mustered the courage to climb up with a lantern-style flashlight. The ladder squealed as I pulled it down, each creak echoing through the dark hallway. My stomach tightened with dread, and my pulse pounded in my ears. The air grew colder as I stuck my head through the attic hatch, the beam of light sweeping across dusty beams and old boxes. The space was cramped, filled with random junk the landlord or previous tenants had left behind. Battered suitcases, cardboard boxes filled with old magazines, and a few pieces of broken furniture. A stale odor of insulation and dry rot assaulted my nostrils. I heard no scurrying, saw no animal droppings. There was an unsettling stillness that felt too deliberate, as though the attic itself was holding its breath. My heart thumped violently against my rib cage, but I saw nothing out of place aside from a thick layer of dust and the usual attic debris. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. I told myself it was enough. Maybe it really was just my imagination. Yet as I climbed down, my arms trembled from more than just exertion. The footsteps continued each subsequent night, intensifying precisely around midnight. Sometimes they were soft, like a person trying to tiptoe. Other times they seemed heavier, as though someone was deliberately pacing back and forth. I lost hours of sleep just lying in bed, muscles tense, listening with dread. Once in a while, I forced myself to stand under the attic hatch, ears straining to confirm the direction of the sound. Each time, I ended up shivering, convinced that there was an actual presence up there. The fear sent icy pinpricks across my skin, and I'd find myself swallowing hard in an attempt to keep calm. I decided to ask the landlord more pointedly about the attic. He offered no clear explanation, only muttering that he had always heard something, but never found anything unusual. He claimed to have checked for structural issues and pests, but those professionals never uncovered a cause. I noticed his eyes dart away when he said it. There was a tension in his voice, as though he was holding back details. I left the conversation more unnerved than before, feeling the paranoia coil tighter around my mind. My heartbeat spiked whenever the topic came up, and I would taste the bitter tang of fear at the back of my throat. Another week passed. Sleep deprivation was taking a toll on me. My work performance suffered because I was constantly exhausted and agitated. I tried turning on the TV or radio at low volume to mask the attic noises, but every night I'd still hear those footsteps creeping over the background hum. One night, about 8 days after I first arrived, I decided to gather every ounce of courage I had and climb up there again. This time, I resolved to wait quietly, hidden among the stacks of boxes, to see if anything would move if I stayed silent long enough. My plan was simple. Go up before the footsteps started, switch off the flashlight, and remain completely still. I reasoned that if it was an animal, I might see it scurrying around once it felt safe. If it was an intruder, I'd at least confirm their presence. The thought of confronting an actual person made my hands shake. My chest felt constricted, as though my body was warning me this was a terrible idea. But the gnawing fear inside me demanded answers. So I climbed up around 11:30 that night. The attic was cool and smelled like stale cardboard. Dust motes danced in the narrow beam of my lantern, which I kept on the lowest setting. I crouched behind a pile of crates near the center of the attic, forcing myself to slow my breath. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure anything up there could hear it. The minutes dragged on, and every muscle in my body remained coiled, ready to spring. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck, and my mouth felt as dry as sandpaper. Around midnight, I heard the first shuffle, a faint shift of weight, as though a foot had nudged a box. My heart surged. I forced myself to remain still, though my lungs burned for deeper breaths. Then came another noise, almost like a deliberate footstep. The wooden planks creaked softly. A cold wave of terror rippled through me. My pulse raced so violently I was trembling, each heartbeat echoing in my ears. In the darkness beyond the reach of my lantern, I caught a glimpse of movement, a silhouette crossing the narrow aisle between stacks of dusty boxes. It was low to the ground, as though whoever or whatever it was had hunched over. My entire body froze in place. My mind insisted I must be imagining it, but my eyes disagreed. There was something there. I tried to call out but found my throat almost paralyzed, my voice failing before it could form words. Even if I could speak, I wasn't sure I wanted to give myself away. I waited, muscles on the verge of cramping from tension. The shape paused behind a large trunk on the opposite side of the attic. Then, after several agonizing seconds, it moved again, drifting silently toward a row of boxes. I thought I saw a faint outline, arms folded close, a posture that seemed almost bestial. Desperation outweighed my caution. I forced out a hushed greeting, but there was no response. I swallowed the lump in my throat and tried to inch closer. My hand accidentally brushed against a loose piece of wood, knocking it against a stack of boxes. The clatter echoed through the attic like thunder. Instantly, the shape darted out of sight, dissolving into the pitch-black corners. My flashlight beam swept the space frantically, but nothing remained except the swirling dust. I stifled a panicked gasp and backed away, heart pounding so violently it made me nauseous. The flashlight trembled in my grip, illuminating only motionless crates and discarded junk. My nerves were shot, every hair on my arm standing on end. I dashed down the ladder and practically collapsed in the hallway, chest heaving with ragged breaths. I didn't bother folding the attic hatch. I just ran to my bedroom, locked the door, and sat there in darkness with my mind racing. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I envisioned that crouched figure gliding through the attic. My skin still tingled with dread, and a band of anxiety squeezed my lungs so tightly I thought I'd suffocate. I kept asking myself if I had really seen a silhouette or if my imagination, fueled by insomnia, had conjured it. But deep down, I knew I'd seen something tangible, something that moved with purpose. That night, I stayed awake, drifting into a state of half-awareness where every floorboard creak sent icy jolts along my spine. When morning finally arrived, I felt both relieved and utterly drained. Days passed, but the activity in the attic didn't abate. I heard sporadic tapping and faint skittering at odd times, sometimes earlier in the evening, sometimes well past midnight. One night, I was startled awake by a single loud knock directly above my bed. I shot up, body drenched in cold sweat, pulse reverberating in my eardrums. A creeping dread now followed me through every waking moment. Even during daylight, I felt as though I was being watched. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of rooms. At times, I thought I sensed a presence standing just out of sight. My concentration deteriorated, and I began making mistakes at work. I'd come home each evening with a tight knot of apprehension in my gut, preparing for another disturbed night. The house itself felt alive, not in a comforting way, but in a predatory sense, like it was feeding on my anxiety. At one point, I considered leaving altogether. The fear grew so severe that I caught myself flinching at the smallest sounds. My appetite vanished, and a persistent, trembling tension remained in my muscles. I tried to reason with myself that I couldn't just abandon my lease and my job. Yet each evening, returning to that place felt like walking into a nightmare. The landlord's vague remarks haunted me. I wondered why he never spoke plainly about the attic. Maybe he feared if he told me more, I'd run and never pay another month's rent. In an attempt to regain some sense of control, I decided to install a small wireless camera in the attic. My hands shook while setting it up, a fine sheen of sweat covering my forehead. I placed it on a rafter beam, aimed at the largest open area, hoping I'd catch some video evidence. The first night of recording showed nothing but darkness and the occasional flicker of dust near the lens. The second night, I nearly dropped my phone in terror when I reviewed the footage. At one point, around 12:03 a.m., the camera shook slightly, as though something passed very close to it. A blur of motion could be seen at the bottom corner of the frame, something tall enough to partially block the camera view. I couldn't make out a distinct form, but it was enough to confirm I wasn't imagining this. My hands went cold, and I felt my stomach twist with a nauseating mixture of horror and vindication. Something was up there, messing with my camera. For several nights, I avoided even thinking about going up again. The presence overhead felt more oppressive than ever. Whenever the footsteps started, my heart would pound so fiercely I thought it might burst. My breaths came shallow and rapid, and I felt trapped, pinned down by dread. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep living in denial. Either I confronted this thing, or it would consume me. So I planned one final trip to the attic. My goal wasn't to fight anything. I just wanted to gather my belongings and get the hell out of that house. I decided to retrieve my camera, see if it caught anything else, and then leave the next day. On my last night there, I waited until the footsteps began around midnight, letting the adrenaline sharpen my senses. My body vibrated with fear, yet I climbed the ladder, every rung creaking beneath my weight. I felt a drop of cold sweat roll down my temple, and my mouth went impossibly dry. Once I was up in that cramped space, I turned on my flashlight, bracing myself for whatever might be lurking. The beam swept across the cluttered boxes, old trunks, and broken furniture. The camera was still where I had placed it. Gathering my courage, I moved toward it, trying not to make too much noise. My breath echoed inside my own head, and my hands were clammy against the flashlight. Just then, I caught a flicker of motion in my peripheral vision. I whipped the flashlight around. Something crouched behind a large pile of boxes, hunched low, but undeniably there. I felt every cell in my body shriek in terror. The shape rose slightly, the top of a head and the outline of shoulders coming into view. My heart felt ready to explode, and I had to fight the urge to scream. I stood frozen, locked in a silent stalemate with whatever hid in that corner. Time seemed to stretch on forever. The stale attic air pressed against my lungs, refusing to let me breathe freely. I wanted to run, but my feet refused to move. Then a faint scraping sound broke the silence, like a hand shifting across the wooden floor. In that moment, reason deserted me. Clutching the camera, I stumbled backward, half falling down the ladder. My knees buckled as I landed, and I crashed onto the hallway floor in a tangle of limbs. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I barely registered it. I slammed the hatch shut, scrambled to my feet, and locked myself in the bedroom, body shaking uncontrollably. My mind raced with the indescribable certainty that I had come face to face with something that defied explanation. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I packed everything I could fit into my car and left the rest behind. The landlord never demanded an explanation. He only asked if I was sure I wanted to go so soon. I gave him a terse answer, alluding to the persistent noises. He must have understood something deeper was wrong, but he didn't press the issue. My heart still hammered even as I drove away from that house, as though the memory of the attic's darkness clung to me like a permanent stain. To this day, I don't know exactly what I encountered in that attic. Whenever I think back on it, a chill runs down my spine, and my pulse throbs with that familiar tinge of panic. Sometimes I consider the possibility that it was a vagrant or a trespasser. Other times, I'm convinced it was something not quite human, some presence tethered to that space. Either way, I cannot rid myself of the sensation that it was more than a mere intruder. In quiet moments, I recall the silent shape shifting in the shadows, the way it seemed to watch me, waiting for me to step closer. A strangling wave of dread always follows. Even now, in a new place far from that cursed house, I sometimes bolt awake in the dead of night, half convinced I hear the faint creak of footsteps above me. I'm left with the unsettling conclusion that some houses carry their own silent watchers, entities that linger in the hidden corners where we seldom look. There are things in our world that scuttle around just beyond our perception, feeding on fear and doubt, waiting patiently for an unsuspecting tenant to wander into their domain. My experience in that small attic remains a bleak reminder that sometimes the greatest horror isn't what we see, but what stands just beyond the rim of the flashlight's glow, daring us to venture closer. And even after leaving, the memory stays with me, lingering at the edge of my consciousness, whispering that once you've heard footsteps in the attic, you never truly forget the shape that made them. I sensed something was wrong the moment I opened my front door that night. The hallway light flickered in a sickly yellow glow, casting misshapen shadows against the narrow walls. The smell of stale beer from the bar downstairs drifted upward, mingling with the lingering odor of frying oil and cheap disinfectant. It felt as though the entire building exhaled a heavy sigh of fatigue, and I couldn't shake the impression that I wasn't alone, despite having come back to an apartment I believed was safely locked. I first noticed the disturbance in the kitchen. The drawers, which I typically keep closed, were half open, and a few glasses had been rearranged in the cabinet. At first, I wondered if I'd been so exhausted earlier that I had forgotten to tidy up. Yet as I ran my finger along the countertop, I couldn't remember ever leaving glasses in such disarray. My heart quickened and a dull throb began pulsing at the back of my neck. A voice in my head told me it could be a simple oversight, something mundane, but the uneasy feeling settling in my gut told me otherwise. That sense of being watched began almost immediately. Even as I tried to relax in my living room, flipping absent-mindedly through television channels, I couldn't shake the nagging certainty that someone was observing me. The overhead lamp buzzed, washing the room in a harsh, artificial glow. Outside, I heard the distant clamor of people leaving the bar below. Muffled laughter, the scraping of chairs, the slamming of car doors. Underneath those familiar sounds, there was something else. I caught a faint creaking, a subtle shift that came from somewhere within the apartment. It could have been the old pipes. It could have been the floor settling. But it felt more like footsteps. I tried to sleep that night, forcing myself to close my eyes, but my pulse hammered so hard I thought it might burst through my rib cage. My breaths were shallow and uneven. Every creak from the corridor outside made me clench my teeth, and I kept picturing someone standing just beyond my bedroom door. Each time I mustered the courage to check, I was met with an empty, unremarkable hallway. The only thing that greeted me was the faint odor of old plaster and the flickering light from the kitchen clock. Over the next few days, subtle mysteries began to stack up. Items disappeared or moved without explanation. A coffee mug I was certain I'd put on the counter was gone the next morning. A small towel from the bathroom vanished. My salt shaker, which I swore had been on the dining table, disappeared without a trace. I started to triple-check the locks on the front door. The windows, all securely barred, remained intact. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere. Each morning, I'd examine the door handle for scratches, the windowsills for marks, but I found nothing. It was as though whoever, or whatever, had slipped inside did so without leaving a single clue. I grew more suspicious every day. Although I'd never been close to my neighbors, I listened carefully to any hints of new activity in the building's corridors. Sometimes I overheard them complaining about the bar that never seemed to close until the small hours. Other times, I caught whispers of frustration about the building's outdated security. I tried to bring up my concerns casually, hinting that strange things were happening in my apartment. Nobody seemed to relate. One neighbor said in an offhand remark that I probably needed better locks and suggested I change them. But I felt that wasn't enough. I wanted to believe a faulty lock explained these eerie occurrences, but the door itself looked undamaged, the deadbolt still intact every morning. The next step I took was installing a camera in my living room. I positioned it strategically to capture both the hallway entrance and the doorway leading to the tiny kitchen. I wanted proof. If someone was truly sneaking in, I needed to confirm it. Yet each morning I found that camera inexplicably turned toward the wall. No footprints, no traces of interference on the device itself. Just a complete shift in angle that suggested someone was deliberately sabotaging my recordings. I watched the few seconds of footage I managed to capture before the camera was moved, but there was nothing. Only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the reflection of the living room's lamp. Then the view turned useless. The longer I stared at the blank footage, the more my stomach twisted in knots. My mind began to slip into a perpetual state of dread. It felt like my nerves were frayed, every small noise amplified in my ears. The ceiling fan's gentle whir sounded like a thunderous roar at times. The drip of the bathroom faucet made my skin crawl. Late one night, I tried to calm myself with a glass of water, only to feel an intense chill wash over me as I stepped into the kitchen. The entire room felt colder, as though someone had opened a window to let in a winter gust. But the windows were closed, the blinds still drawn. The sense that another presence lingered in the corner of the kitchen made my scalp prickle with fear. I stood completely still, heart pounding, feeling sweat trickle down my temples. My legs nearly gave out from under me. When I finally gathered enough courage to flick on the overhead light, there was, of course, no one there. As the week wore on, my paranoia intensified. I started keeping a baseball bat by my bed, though I'd never been the type of person who felt comfortable resorting to threats or violence. Some nights, I'd wake up with the distinct impression that the doorknob to my bedroom was rattling. My chest would seize up, and I'd hold my breath, listening, barely daring to move. The entire world seemed suspended in that agonizing moment when my mind was torn between wanting to scream and wanting to remain absolutely quiet, so as not to provoke whatever lurked beyond the door. People at work noticed my anxiety. I caught glimpses of their concerned faces. One colleague took me aside and mentioned I looked pale, exhausted, like I hadn't slept in days. I admitted to feeling stressed, but didn't divulge the entire story. It felt too absurd to say I believed there was some force, human or otherwise, prowling inside my apartment at night, stealing random objects and leaving me in a constant state of panic. I told them I had insomnia and left it at that, although internally I fought the urge to confide in someone, anyone, about the terror that haunted me after sundown. One evening, I resolved to do a more thorough search of the apartment. I examined every closet, pulled furniture away from the walls, lifted the rugs. Beneath the kitchen sink, there was a small plywood panel that I'd never bothered to open. Praying it might explain the strange occurrences, I carefully unscrewed it. A wave of musty air hit me, and I felt goosebumps erupt along my arms. There was a cramped gap between the wall studs. Nothing big enough for a person, but large enough for something to possibly move through if it was desperate. The dark space seemed to stretch downward beyond the floor level, possibly connecting to the basement. I shone a flashlight inside and saw only dust and spider webs. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was peering into a hidden corner of the building that might hide secrets older than my lease. In the days that followed, the footsteps and missing objects continued. I started to question my own mind. Had I developed a bizarre sleepwalking habit? It seemed too far-fetched, but I was truly desperate for a rational explanation. I tried placing flour on the kitchen floor at night, hoping footprints would appear if someone crept around. Sure enough, each morning the flour was either smeared or gone, as though carefully cleaned up. My heart lurched every time I discovered another sign that my efforts to catch this intruder were being thwarted. It was no longer a random nuisance. It was personal. Amid the swirling chaos of suspicion and dread, I found myself thinking about the bar below me. Its patrons poured out at odd hours, stumbling onto the sidewalk, carrying their raucous energy into the otherwise quiet night. Sometimes the sound of them talking or singing sloppily drifted up into my windows. I realized, with growing discomfort, that the bar's late closing time served almost like a protective hum. As long as I heard them, I could tell myself that the noises in my apartment might be from the bar. But once the bar finally closed and the street fell silent, my apartment became something else entirely. A hushed chamber where my fear echoed off every wall. I tried to confide in the landlord. I mentioned items were disappearing and that I believed there could be a hidden entry point. He brushed me off, claiming I was imagining things. He said it was an old building with lots of quirks, that sometimes pests or vagrants found a way in. But if I kept the place tidy and locked, I'd have nothing to worry about. His indifference made my stomach churn. I left the conversation feeling more isolated than ever, convinced he either didn't believe me or had reasons for not wanting to dig deeper. Then, one particularly suffocating night, I heard a series of dull thuds in the hallway just outside my bedroom. My blood turned to ice. Clutching the bat, I inched toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The sounds were rhythmic, slow, almost deliberate, as if someone was testing each step, measuring the distance between my door and the living room. My heart battered against my ribcage so violently that I could feel my pulse in my throat. My palms were slick with sweat, and each breath was shallow. I could not bring myself to open the door immediately. Instead, I stood there, trembling, imagining the worst shapes in my mind's eye. Was this an intruder? A neighbor with some twisted habit? Or was it something else entirely? Something that defied logic? The footsteps paused right at the threshold of my bedroom. Silence pressed in, thick and stifling. I felt my entire body tensing, ready to spring or scream. Then the footsteps receded, fading toward the kitchen. A sudden surge of adrenaline compelled me to yank the door open, brandishing the bat like a shield. The corridor was empty. My bedroom light spilled weakly into the hallway, and all I saw were the same worn floorboards and peeling wallpaper. I stayed up all that night, perched on my couch with every lamp blazing, eyes fixed on the door. My skin crawled at every shift of the building's old structure. By dawn, I was half delirious with exhaustion, but I refused to sleep. When the sun finally cast its pale light through the window, I decided I had to do something drastic. My sense of reality had reached a breaking point. I became convinced that the only way to reclaim my sanity was to catch this presence, whatever it was, in the act. With renewed determination, I set up multiple cameras, one in the kitchen, one near the front door, and one in the bedroom aiming at the hallway. I taped them down, tied them with zip ties, and carefully angled them so they couldn't be turned without force. That night, I left every light in the apartment on and pretended to sleep in my bed, though I remained completely alert. Hours crawled by, and the old pipes hissed in the silence. The bar downstairs finally shut, letting the night turn eerily still. My eyelids grew heavier, but I fought the urge to doze off. Sometime around 3 or 4 in the morning, I heard a creak from the corner of the living room. My spine stiffened. A wave of fear swept through me so intense that I nearly dropped my phone. I strained my ears for any further sound, but the hush was absolute. For several excruciating minutes, there was nothing. Then, ever so faintly, I heard the softest shuffle, like fabric brushing against the wall. My limbs began to tremble, adrenaline coursing through me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I flung the bedroom door open, phone flashlight in one hand, the bat in the other. The cameras were all still in place, oriented as I had left them. But in the middle of the living room, the rug was rumpled, as though something had just slipped beneath it or dragged across it. My breath came in sharp gasps. The hair on my arms stood on end. A full minute passed before I dared to step forward. Each footstep felt like I was crossing a minefield. As I knelt to inspect the rug, I expected at any moment for some hand, claw, or shape to burst out from underneath. But all I found was the grimy hardwood floor. However, in one corner, the floorboard was slightly lifted, revealing a slim gap underneath. With sweaty hands, I pried it open. A chill, pungent draft wafted out. I aimed my flashlight into the gap and saw a small, hidden space below. It was too dark to make out details, but it was clear the underfloor cavity led beyond the living room, possibly connecting to the entire building. A sudden dread overtook me. Someone, had been moving through the structure itself. No forced entry because the intruder didn't need a door. A labyrinth of passages or crawl spaces snaked beneath the floors and behind the walls, perfect for vanishing at the slightest hint of detection. My hands shook as I pictured an entity, maybe a person, maybe something else, twisting through the guts of the building like a parasite. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, or the next. All I could think about was leaving. By morning, I packed the essentials in a duffel bag. When daylight finally broke, I hurried out of that apartment, not bothering to notify the landlord or give any sort of explanation. I didn't care about my deposit or my lease. The only thing that mattered was escaping that claustrophobic maze where an unknown presence watched my every move. Even as I stepped out into the relatively fresh air of the street, my heart pounded like a frantic drum, and my skin felt clammy with sweat. I moved out that very day. Finding a short-term rental in another part of the city wasn't easy on such short notice, but I preferred the burden of expense over the creeping dread that came from staying another second in that apartment. For weeks afterward, I caught myself looking over my shoulder, double-checking every lock, listening for phantom footsteps in every new room I entered. My nightmares replayed the creaking of floorboards and the flickering lights. At times, I thought I could hear the bar's distant clamor, even when it was nowhere nearby. I never went back for the rest of my belongings. The few calls I made to the landlord went unanswered. Eventually, I let go of the notion that I'd retrieve anything I left behind. The memory of that hidden space under the floorboard was enough to keep me away forever. Even now, I sometimes relive those nights. I can practically feel my pulse racing, see my trembling hands gripping the doorknob, and sense a cold presence just beyond my field of vision. It's a subtle but persistent horror, the knowledge that something was there. Something that walked softly and watched quietly. The faintest sound of creaking wood still sends a spike of fear through my gut. I got out with my life and my sanity, more or less. Yet a lingering unease has lodged itself in my mind, whispering in my ear that the walls around us might not be as solid or as empty as we want to believe. The first time I set foot in that abandoned factory, I felt a chill crawl over my skin that had nothing to do with the cold. The place stood at the edge of town, its rusted gates and crumbling walls, a silent testament to decades of neglect. My company had acquired it with the idea of turning the site into a modern facility. I was assigned to inspect the infrastructure and gather preliminary information for the renovation team. The official reason was simple: to check the old building's structural integrity, document what needed repairs, and report back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been singled out because nobody else wanted to be alone in there. There was an unspoken reputation about the place, one that made people glance sideways whenever the subject came up. I had never believed in ghosts or curses, But the moment I walked through those doors, every hair on my body stood on end, as if to warn me of something waiting in the shadows. I remember that first day clearly. The air was stale, thick with dust, and smelled faintly of old machinery and rotting wood. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous main hall, each sound amplified by the emptiness around me. The only other presence was the occasional scurry of rats or the flutter of pigeons nesting in the rafters. Even those creatures seemed uneasy, as though they were intruders too. Overhead, the few ceiling lights that still functioned flickered so inconsistently that it felt like stepping into the middle of a strobe effect. Each flicker cast new shadows that shifted and writhed against the walls. In that half-light, my eyes played tricks on me, making me think I saw movement in places I knew were empty. That was when I pulled out my camera, an old but reliable digital model, and began snapping photos for reference. My plan was to be thorough, covering every angle so I could brief the rest of the team. Better to do this right the first time than have to return more often than necessary. As I approached a disused assembly line, I noticed how the machines looked like giant skeletons of a once bustling workplace. Every bit of metal was corroded with rust, every conveyor belt thick with grime. I paused, zoomed in on a broken control panel, took a shot, and continued. The building was silent aside from the echo of my shudder. Then I turned a corner into a narrow corridor that led toward a blocked-off wing. I'd been told it used to be the administrative section, but the company had closed it even before the factory shut down. The door was locked, so I stayed on the other side, simply taking pictures through the stained glass pane in the door, hoping to catch anything of note on the other side. Each click of my camera amplified my unease. The corridor's overhead light was dimmer than anywhere else, and the walls were so aged that small cracks formed spiderweb patterns across the plaster. I took 3 photos in quick succession, a habit I'd picked up to ensure at least one clear shot. When I finally reviewed the pictures on the camera's tiny screen, my hand went numb. In the first photo, the corridor appeared as I'd seen it, empty, with the locked door at the far end. In the second, there was an unmistakable shape in the bottom right corner, a figure wearing a dark overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat. My breath caught in my throat. It was so faint that it could have passed as a trick of the light or a reflection, but I instinctively knew it wasn't. The figure's outline was too sharp, too coherent to be random. By the third photo, taken just a fraction of a second later, the figure was gone. I whirled around, shining my flashlight down the corridor, heart hammering so hard it reverberated in my ears. No one was there. That immediate rush of panic sent a surge of adrenaline through me, and I tasted metal on my tongue, as if I'd bitten something inside my mouth. My chest tightened, and it felt like the very air in that corridor had thickened, resisting my every breath. For a moment, I considered calling out, but my throat was too dry to form words. Instead, I forced myself to step closer, shining the flashlight into every nook and cranny. The shadows leapt and danced, concealing nothing but peeling paint and cracked flooring. Yet my skin tingled with an inexplicable certainty that I'd been watched. Trying to steady my nerves, I let out a shuddering exhale and reasoned with myself that it could have been my own reflection or some odd interplay of the dim light. I told myself I was letting the factory's creepy vibe play tricks on my mind. Still, my hands were trembling as I slipped the camera into my bag and made my way back to the main hall. I told a colleague later that day, one of the renovation planners, and he remarked that camera malfunctions happen. He suggested I had caught my own silhouette at an odd angle. I wanted to believe him, but the shape in the photo looked like nothing I'd ever worn, and the hat and coat seemed distinctly old-fashioned. I didn't push the matter. As the conversation ended, I realized that every time I even thought about that corridor, goosebumps rippled across my arms. In the days that followed, I returned to the factory with more specialized equipment, measuring tools, humidity sensors, and additional cameras. My job required thoroughness, so I had no choice. Each time I felt a growing sense of dread. It was as if the building itself was alive, exhaling cold drafts that smelled of decay. The wind outside rattled loose panels, causing bizarre echoes that sometimes sounded like hushed whispers. My flashlight would catch movements at the edges of my vision, scraps of paper fluttering on the floor, or the faint shift of a plastic sheet covering broken windows. But they always startled me, making my pulse spike uncontrollably. As I continued my inspections, small disturbances escalated into more unsettling events. One day, while examining a half-collapsed staircase leading to a second-floor storage area, I heard a drawn-out scraping sound reverberating through the corridor below me. I froze, thinking perhaps a piece of metal was sliding across the floor, but when I went to check, there was nothing that could have made such a noise. My stomach twisted into knots, and my scalp prickled with the kind of fear that makes it impossible to think logically. I had to lean against a wall to keep from shaking. On another occasion, I was trying to document the old electrical system. The fuse boxes looked ancient, with tangled wires that probably hadn't carried electricity in years. As I ran my flashlight over the cables, something clattered behind me, like a door slamming shut. The immediate rush of adrenaline made me nearly drop my flashlight. My heart thudded so violently I felt it in my throat, and I started sweating despite the chill of the factory. When I turned to look, none of the doors had moved. They all stood exactly as they had before, stiff with age and locked in place by rust and debris. Yet the echo of that slam hung in the air, sending my thoughts spinning. I felt watched again, as if a dozen invisible eyes were tracking my every move. I constantly tried to rationalize these incidents. Old buildings make noise. Wind can blow things over. My fatigue could cause me to mishear. But each new visit tore another hole in my confidence. I found myself double-checking doorways, glancing over my shoulder at every corner, and jumping at the slightest metallic creak. My colleagues noticed my unease, although they never said much to my face. I heard that some of them started whispering about me looking paler, acting more paranoid. A friend from the office, in an indirect conversation, asked if I was sleeping well. I lied and told him I was fine. The truth was, I was finding it nearly impossible to get a restful night's sleep. I'd fall into a shallow doze only to dream about that corridor, or about faint silhouettes drifting through the factory halls. The worst part was how the figure in the overcoat and hat invaded my thoughts. I began to see it even when I wasn't holding a camera. Once I caught a glimpse of someone wearing similar attire reflected in a cracked window pane on the second floor. I turned around so abruptly I almost stumbled over some debris. There was nobody in sight, just the murky corridor behind me. The reflection had looked so solid, so undeniably real, that my heart pounded as if I just sprinted a mile. Another time I thought I saw that same figure at the far end of the main hall, just standing there, unmoving, partially obscured by a row of broken machinery. In a blink, it was gone. Each encounter felt like a direct threat to my sanity, as if the boundary between the real and unreal was thinning out under the factory's oppressive weight. I started dreading my next assignments there. Every new day, I'd gather my tools and cameras, swallowing the lump in my throat as I drove to the site. The interior felt heavier, the shadows darker, and the silence more suffocating with each visit. The few functioning lights seemed to flicker worse than ever, and the wind howled through the open windows like the factory itself was groaning in protest. Eventually, I told my supervisor that certain areas of the factory were unsafe and needed to be sealed off until we could get professional contractors to stabilize them. The front offices had sagging floors, the basement had flooding issues, and the old administrative corridor seemed unstable. In truth, I wanted an excuse to limit my time in that wing, particularly in that corridor where I'd snapped the damning photo. But my supervisor insisted that documentation was necessary for every nook and cranny if we wanted the renovation funds approved. I was left with no choice but to return. That afternoon, I felt more on edge than ever. My skin prickled, and I kept wiping sweat from my forehead. Even though the air was so cold it stung my lungs. I forced myself through the routine, measuring cracks in the walls, checking the floors for water damage, photographing everything I could. When I reached the corridor that led to the old administrative wing, my palms started sweating profusely, and I found it hard to swallow. The overhead light flickered, painting the walls in a sequence of abrupt flashes. I stepped carefully over broken tiles until I reached the locked door. I raised my camera to get a few more shots through the stained glass. The lens focused. The flash popped, And for a split second, I thought I saw a shape behind the door on the other side. Dark coat, wide-brimmed hat. My heart hammered so hard it made my vision pulse. I backed away, trying to control my breathing. My pulse throbbed in my neck, and my hands were slick with sweat. Every instinct screamed for me to turn and run, but I felt compelled to see if there was any logical explanation for what my eyes perceived. I fumbled for the ring of old keys someone had given me, certain none of them would fit that administrative door, but desperate enough to try. With shaking fingers, I tested each key. The lock refused to budge. I felt a presence on the other side, an almost tangible weight pressing against the door, as if someone or something was leaning against it, waiting for me to force it open. Defeated, I turned away, snapping one last photo over my shoulder. That's when I heard it, a scraping, dragging sound echoing from behind the door. My stomach lurched. This was no trick of the wind. This was deliberate movement, a slow, drawn-out sound of something heavy being pulled across the floor. My rational mind struggled to find a mundane explanation, maybe something collapsing deeper inside, or debris shifting under its own weight. But the hair on my arm stood on end, and a queasiness settled in the pit of my stomach. I realized I was trembling so hard that it was difficult to maintain my balance. I forced myself down the corridor in the opposite direction, each step feeling like I was walking through molasses. The corridor seemed longer than ever before, stretching into darkness. I could feel eyes on me, though I refused to look back. My heart was racing, and the sensation of being watched was so powerful it made me dizzy. Each breath felt like a shallow gasp that provided no relief. I broke into a half-run, stumbling through the main hall, ignoring the protest of my knees, ignoring how the flickering lights seemed to intensify as I passed by. A deep sense of panic pushed me forward until I reached the exit door. I practically burst into the open air, breathing in the crisp outside atmosphere as if it were pure salvation. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and my clothes stuck to my back from cold sweat. For a few minutes I stood outside, collecting myself. I glanced back at the factory's looming facade, trying to decide if I was simply losing my mind or if something genuinely malevolent inhabited that place. It was an internal war. Part of me insisted I was overreacting, that everything had a rational explanation. The other part of me knew, in some primal way, that the figure with the hat and coat existed beyond any logical explanation. I felt it in the marrow of my bones that I was dealing with something that thrived in the darkness, something that could slip in and out of sight at will. I had enough. I told my supervisor that I'd finished everything required, though I knew some areas were only partially documented. I wanted no more part in that building's secrets. A few days later, while compiling my final report, I reviewed all the photographs. Most were standard shots: corroded steel beams, broken windows, collapsed walls. But in 2 frames, I saw that same outline, a faint silhouette in a dark coat and hat, lurking in the background. In one shot, it seemed to stand at the end of a hallway, half hidden by shadows. In another, it was near a corner, its head tilted, as though watching me carefully. No one else wanted to believe me. Whenever I showed the photos to colleagues, they insisted it was a reflection, a camera glitch, or maybe even someone wandering around who I hadn't noticed. Yet the more I looked at those images, the more unsettled I became. The figure's posture was too intentional, too posed, as if it knew exactly how to remain out of direct sight. In the end, I couldn't entirely rid myself of the memory. Even after I submitted my final documentation and handed the project off to the construction team, a sense of unease clung to me like a persistent shadow. I began avoiding the place altogether, which was easy enough once construction crews took over. But sometimes, during a late night at the office, I'd catch myself thinking I saw a shape pass by a reflective surface in the hallway, hat brim low over its face, coat trailing behind. I'd snap to attention, heart pounding, only to find nothing there. To this day, I don't have a neat conclusion or a satisfying explanation. The factory is on track for renovation, and soon it might be unrecognizable beneath layers of fresh paint and new walls. But I can't help wondering if that presence, the figure I saw, will somehow remain, woven into the very foundation of the place. waiting for the next unsuspecting person to wander too far into the old corridors. My only solace is the knowledge that I walked away before it could truly trap me. Even so, there are nights when I lie awake in bed, heart racing, convinced I hear distant scraping sounds or faint footsteps pacing outside my door. I tell myself it's all in my head, that I've let paranoia twist my perspective. But deep down, I know some things can't be explained or exorcised by logic alone. The sense of being watched, of being followed by that silent figure in a hat and coat, has never entirely left me. It lingers, a quiet dread just at the periphery of my vision, reminding me that sometimes we can escape a place, but we cannot escape what that place has awoken within us. I still remember the first time I realized the darkness on the road could hide something far more unsettling than potholes or stray animals. The highway stretched before me like a yawning void, its dim streetlights flickering at odd intervals, as though they were struggling to keep the night at bay. I had been driving for several hours on a particularly lonely route, and the droning hum of the engine was my only companion. My chest felt tight, and a faint, inexplicable anxiety gnawed at me. At first, I thought it might just be exhaustion, but then I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my blood turned to ice. For the briefest of moments, I saw a dark outline of what looked like a person seated in the back. The shape wasn't clear enough to define facial features or clothing, but it was unmistakably human. I jerked the steering wheel in surprise, nearly sending the car off the road. When I whipped my head around to look more closely, there was nothing there. No one. Nothing but shadows. My heart thudded as though it might punch right through my rib cage. The interior of my car felt suffocating, as if a heavy weight pressed on my lungs. Telling myself I must have hallucinated out of sheer exhaustion, I forced my gaze back to the highway. My breathing was ragged, and cold sweat clung to my temples. I reminded myself that it was late, I was tired, and illusions on the road happen to anyone who has been behind the wheel too long. Despite my best attempts at reassurance, a part of me couldn't shake off the prickling awareness that I might not be alone. The memory of that first incident lingered in my mind, its hooks digging deeper with every subsequent journey. My job demands long-distance travel, so I spend more time on remote roads than I do in my own bed. I've grown accustomed to the monotony of highways, the endless sea of asphalt, the occasional glow of roadside diners, and the sensation of drifting between small towns that never seem to change. But after that night, I developed a new habit, constantly checking my rearview mirror. Before, I'd do it out of routine, a quick glance for safety. Now, I catch myself stealing glances at it every few seconds, half hoping not to see anything at all, and half terrified that I might see the figure again. 2 months later, it happened again. It was another pitch-black night on a virtually empty stretch of road. The air felt static, as though everything outside my vehicle was frozen in time. My shoulders were tight, and the tension in my neck had blossomed into a dull ache. I remember the glare of my headlights picking up the pale lines of the road as the wind whispered softly against the windows. I felt that strange sense of watchfulness, like something was right behind me, paying far too much attention to every breath I took. My chest constricted in fear, and a wave of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the hum of the tires on the asphalt. Then I glanced into the mirror. The shape was there again, a hunched figure, like someone leaning forward, waiting for me to turn around. My breath caught in my throat, and it felt like my heart stopped momentarily before hammering into a rapid gallop. My palms grew slick with sweat, and I could feel the shiver creeping from my spine up to my scalp. I yanked my eyes from the mirror and forced myself to look at the road ahead, but I could hardly resist the urge to check the back seat. Summoning courage, I shifted my gaze just enough to peek over my shoulder. The seat was empty, plain fabric, no sign of an occupant, yet my entire body was screaming that I wasn't alone. The emptiness was more disturbing than if I had actually found someone sitting there. From that point on, I refused to drive at night with the cabin lights off. I remember flipping the interior light on so forcefully that my knuckles cracked against the switch. A weak, yellowish glow flooded the car, illuminating the worn upholstery and the detritus of fast food wrappers scattered across the passenger seat. For a while, the light seemed to keep the apparition at bay, or at least it made me feel slightly more grounded. I convinced myself that if anything truly stood behind me, I'd see it illuminated. But it didn't stop the sensation of being watched. On many drives, even with the light on, I'd feel a tingle crawl across my skin, as if unseen eyes were drilling into my back. My heart would accelerate, and a bitter taste of adrenaline would fill my mouth. My hands would tighten around the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Every so often, I'd catch flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, but whenever I twisted around, there was nothing. These events began to erode my sense of reality. I started to question if I was losing my mind. Stress from work was constant. The deadlines, the traveling, the relentless pressure to be everywhere at once. It all weighed on me. Maybe my imagination was having a field day with the fatigue. Yet the experiences felt too tangible, too visceral. My nights were plagued by restless sleep, punctuated by the memory of that twisted, murky outline in the back seat. I told a colleague, in an offhand manner, that I'd been seeing strange things during my drives. He shrugged and suggested I find a different route or take a few days off. That was the extent of his advice. But the problem followed me no matter which road I chose. One evening, after finishing a late meeting in a small town, I found myself on the outskirts of nowhere, with only one route that led back to the main highway. Twilight had given way to night, and thick clouds smothered the moonlight. The road was narrow, flanked by looming trees that seemed to crowd toward the asphalt. Their branches formed crooked silhouettes against the starless sky. My headlights sliced through the darkness, revealing just enough of the road to guide me forward but leaving everything else in mysterious shadow. I turned on the interior light right from the start, hoping to avoid any nasty surprises. The engine rumbled as I navigated curve after curve, and a mild but persistent tension settled in my shoulders. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear it moaning as it slipped through the slight gap in my driver's side window. My pulse was steady at first, but the moment I sensed that same suffocating presence behind me, my heart started racing again. A dull ache formed at the base of my skull, and it pounded in sync with my rapid breathing. A particularly sharp turn forced me to slow down, my tires crunching gravel at the edge of the road. I dared a glance in the mirror. This time I didn't see a distinct outline, but I caught a fleeting impression of movement in the back seat. It was like a ripple in the fabric of reality, a flicker that bent the light inside the car. My stomach clenched as if I'd swallowed a ball of ice. My breathing became shallow, and I felt dampness under my arms as sweat soaked my shirt. Rationality told me it was just paranoia, but the fear was overpowering. My eyes darted back to the road, and for a second I thought I saw something dart between the trees. I couldn't be sure. The night was so dark that everything seemed half-formed, shifting in the periphery of my vision. Eventually the road straightened, and I tried to pick up speed. With one hand gripping the wheel, I reached for my phone, hoping to calm my nerves by finding some music or a voice to listen to, anything to chase away the oppressive silence. But the phone screen stayed black. No signal, no data, nothing. As if the entire area had been swallowed by a void. My pulse throbbed in my ears, and a clammy sense of isolation settled over me. That was when a soft sound came from behind me. A faint, raspy whisper, so subtle that I almost missed it. I froze, my body going rigid, eyes glued to the road as if locking onto that yellow line might somehow shield me. The back of my neck tingled, the hairs standing upright. The whisper was unintelligible, like a low sigh, but it crawled through me all the same. My breathing turned erratic, and I felt the dryness in my mouth intensify. The urge to slam on the brakes and leap out of the car was almost irresistible, yet the thought of stepping into that absolute darkness outside was equally terrifying. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling my pulse accelerate right along with the engine's roar. My mind raced with explanations, any rational excuse to keep me from unraveling. Perhaps a draft had slipped through the back window, or maybe the seat's upholstery had settled and created a soft creak. But that tiny voice in my head insisted there was something else, something that defied explanation. By the time I reached the main highway, my chest hurt from how hard my heart had been pounding. I pulled into a deserted gas station, fumbling with the door handle, and stumbled out into the cool night air. My legs felt weak, and I had to steady myself against the side of the car. The lights at the gas station were harsh, fluorescent beams that buzzed overhead. They brought a certain relief, bathing my surroundings in a pale, artificial glow that at least dispelled the worst of the darkness. I stood by the pump, trying to calm my breathing, still half expecting to see someone step out from the back seat. The interior light was still on, revealing only my jacket tossed to one side and a few stray items on the floor. No shadows, no shapes. But I couldn't shake the impression that something lingered. I recall telling an attendant inside the station that I felt uneasy on the road. He just gave me a concerned look and asked if I needed anything. I mumbled that I might just need a coffee, maybe to rest. After grabbing a cup of coffee, I returned to my car. With an exhausted sigh, I slid back into the driver's seat, feeling the tension coil within me once more. I needed to get home, or at least to a motel, somewhere I could turn all the lights on and distance myself from the open road. During the following weeks, my encounters with that intangible presence only seemed to multiply. Sometimes, I'd think I heard faint breathing coming from directly behind my seat. Other times, I'd sense movement out of the corner of my eye, but it would vanish the instant I tried to focus on it. My paranoia soared. I started checking my locks multiple times before driving, scanning the back seat before even starting the engine. I was hyper-aware of every bump and groan of the vehicle. Each squeak of the suspension made my pulse jump. The rational part of me fought to maintain control. I visited a doctor who suggested it might be chronic stress. He offered to prescribe something to help me sleep, but I declined, not wanting to dull my senses while driving. I needed to be alert, if not for the road, then for the nameless thing that insisted on haunting my peripheral vision. One night, on a short trip between two neighboring towns, I decided I'd had enough. The sensation of being followed, watched, hounded was too much to bear. My nerves were frayed to the point of snapping. The interior light was on, but it did nothing to ease the oppression I felt. The air in the car was stifling, and I could smell my own perspiration mixed with the faint scent of old coffee. My heart wouldn't settle into a normal rhythm. My breath kept catching, shallow and panicked. Midway through a deserted stretch, I saw the figure in my mirror again, clearer than ever before. It was crouched, a hazy silhouette leaning between the front seats. It felt so close, as though it could reach out and touch my shoulder at any moment. My vision blurred with panic. Without thinking, I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. My seatbelt dug into my chest, and the momentum threw me forward, but I managed to bring the car to a shuddering halt. My hands shook uncontrollably, and the entire vehicle hummed with the abrupt stop. I didn't dare look behind me. Every muscle in my body tensed, my mind screaming at me to get out of the car and run. Yet some primal instinct told me opening the door would be worse, as if stepping into the pitch-black night would allow whatever it was to follow me outside. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, breathing in rapid, ragged gasps. My eyes brimmed with tears born of terror, and I could almost hear my heartbeat crashing in my ears. Slowly, painfully, I summoned the courage to glance in the rearview mirror once more. It was gone. Only the faint outlines of the back seat stared back at me, illuminated by the pale glow of the overhead light. I wish I could say that moment provided closure, that confronting the presence somehow dispelled it. But the reality is far from comforting. I still make my living by driving these roads at odd hours, and the sensation never truly left. The presence remains an unwanted passenger, hovering at the edge of my vision, waiting for darkness to drown the edges of my sanity. To cope, I've developed a ritual. I check my mirrors before starting the engine. I keep the cabin light on. I set the ventilation system to a steady hum so I can differentiate real noises from mechanical ones, and I keep my phone charged in case I need any semblance of connection to the outside world. These measures help me get from point A to point B, without having a full-scale panic attack. Still, every so often, that intangible dread resurfaces. My breathing shallows, my chest tightens, and my mind conjures the image of a hunched silhouette behind me. I have learned to keep my eyes on the road, to keep driving no matter how much my instincts scream at me to stop and flee. If I stop, I have to face whatever it is that chooses to appear in my mirrors when night swallows the world. I've come to an unsettling acceptance that this phenomenon, be it a figment of my own psyche or some supernatural hitchhiker, may forever accompany me on these endless journeys. The worst part is the not knowing. I don't know if I'm dealing with something purely in my head, or if there truly is an otherworldly entity lurking just out of sight. The seeds of doubt have taken root deep inside my mind, and my attempts to prove or disprove its existence only tighten the knot of dread in my gut. Yet I continue my drives. Each new assignment sets me back on that lonely highway, interior light glowing, heart hammering, every nerve in my body poised for the moment the atmosphere changes. When the darkness thickens and the silence grows oppressive, I know it's near. The reflection in the mirror might waver, or I'll feel the slightest movement of air. Then the fear returns in full force, along with a cold sweat and that stomach-churning sense of being cornered. Each time I survive another night without any tangible harm, but I'm left with the lingering, unshakable feeling that one day this presence might reveal itself more directly. And I'm not sure I want to find out what that means. For now, I try to anchor myself to small certainties. The gas gauge, the navigation display, the hum of the tires. They remind me that the real world still exists beyond my frantic imagination. But every glance in the mirror reminds me I might not be as alone as I think. And that knowledge festers beneath every mile I drive, as persistent as the beating of my own heart. I've chosen to keep driving because I can't let the fear paralyze me. Maybe it's foolish. Maybe it's a denial of what truly lurks in the shadows. But it's my only option right now, to coexist with something I can't define or understand. And so I drive on, night after night, with my hands gripping the wheel, my chest constricted by a tension that refuses to leave. The glow of the interior light stands as my thin shield against the gloom, yet its faint halo only reveals so much. The darkness beyond is vast, patient, and ever watchful. Even as I struggle to swallow my panic, it creeps closer, taking residence in the corner of my eye, in the hush of late-night highways, in the flicker of the mirror that betrays the most terrifying possibility of all, that perhaps I was never truly alone in this car to begin with. The moment I first stepped foot into the basement of our old metalworking plant, I felt that subtle grip of unease tighten around my ribs, making it hard to breathe. It was an ancient storage area with a low ceiling, scattered pillars, and a lingering scent of rust that clung to the back of my throat. I had heard rumors from my co-workers, stories about shadows moving in the corners, tools vanishing or reappearing in odd places, and a heavy presence that seemed to watch from the darkness. For a long time, I dismissed it all as small-town superstition. Yet the very first time I descended alone to fetch a batch of specialized screws, I could sense something in the stale air, something I couldn't quite name, pressing in on me. I walked in with casual skepticism, but walked out drenched in sweat, convinced I had seen a dark figure glide behind a pillar. And from that point on, every visit to that subterranean chamber ignited a hollow dread inside me that only grew more insistent with each step I took into that dimly lit realm. I've been employed at this metalworking facility for almost 10 years, ever since I moved to the outskirts of this remote town, looking for steady work. The plant itself is over half a century old, an immense gray structure of iron beams and dented metal walls. The main floor thrums with the mechanical roar of hydraulic presses, metal cutters, and the clang of steel rods colliding. Bright lamps hang from the high ceiling, illuminating the swirling dust motes and the haze of particles that never fully settle. On the surface, everything seems old but serviceable, worn down yet functional, like a tired boxer still capable of landing a punch. Deeper within lies the basement, a place many insist is best avoided. Those who have ventured down there often speak in low voices about hearing scraping sounds against concrete or heavy footsteps in the corridors when nobody is present. A few refuse to descend at all, claiming they've felt something brush past them, a whisper of motion in the stillness. I heard these tales countless times, usually brushed them off. When pressed, some of the older employees would mention unexplained chills, tools that went missing, or a feeling as if they were being followed. They rarely gave details. There was an unspoken agreement that certain things were better left alone. I merely listened with polite curiosity, never quite buying into the ghost stories. Yet curiosity and disbelief don't shield you when you find yourself alone in that labyrinth, forced to search for spare components among dusty shelves and flickering light bulbs. My first unnerving encounter came on a day when production needed a specific type of screw stored in the basement. The shift lead simply mentioned the location, gave me the shelf number, and told me I'd better hurry before lunch was over. I headed down, ignoring the gnawing sense of apprehension at the base of my skull. The short flight of concrete steps took me to a narrow corridor. The overhead lights buzzed weakly, casting a sickly glow that illuminated the damp, stained walls. Rust flecks clung to every surface, and the entire place smelled of stale water, motor oil, and something unidentifiable, like decaying metal. As I walked in, my boots echoed on the uneven floor. I felt the hair on my arms stand up from a draft of cold air that didn't seem to come from any visible vent. My breath caught as I stepped under a flickering bulb, scanning the rows of steel shelves that towered from floor to ceiling. Old parts and abandoned tools were crammed everywhere, each covered in a film of dust and neglect. I found the shelf labeled with the correct marking and began rummaging for the screws. That's when I spotted it, a dark silhouette at the far corner, near the perimeter of the dim halo cast by the flickering light. It was motionless for a second, then shifted slightly, dissolving behind a thick cement pillar as if receding into the wall. My heart hammered so intensely I could practically hear the blood rushing in my ears. I swallowed hard, mouth suddenly parched, and tried to call out to see if a coworker was playing a prank. All that responded was the low hum of electrical light and my own ragged breathing. Then metal clattered behind a shelf across the room, making my nerves jolt. Something fell to the ground, a sharp clang that resonated through the stillness, followed by hurried footsteps heading deeper into the shadows. My entire body tensed. I could taste bile in my throat, and my hands trembled as I gripped the box I had come for. Fear spiked through my core, and all rational thought evaporated. I barely recall stumbling out, climbing the stairs so fast that I nearly tripped. By the time I reached the main floor, my shirt was soaked in sweat and I could hardly catch my breath. I managed to deliver the screws and get on with my day, but the memory of that shape remained etched in my mind. In the weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself it was just the dim lighting combined with an overactive imagination. But every time I returned to the basement, that dreadful sensation came back, like cold fingers skimming down my spine. On some days, the feeling was weaker, a mild anxiety that hovered just at the edge of consciousness. On others, it was almost paralyzing, forcing me to move quickly and avoid looking too closely at the dark corners. I noticed small anomalies. A wrench that I had left in one place would appear on a different shelf, or a flashlight would turn up drained of power when I knew its batteries were fresh. More than once, I heard scraping sounds echoing in the distance, as though someone was dragging a metal rod against the floor. Whenever I mustered enough courage to investigate, the noises would stop abruptly, leaving only oppressive silence. My coworkers began to notice changes in my behavior. They asked if I was getting enough sleep, if I was sick, or if the heavy workload was affecting me. I tried to explain that something was off about the basement, but each time I started to describe the moving shadow or the inexplicable sounds, I found I couldn't articulate the sheer dread that accompanied them. Some coworkers empathized, mentioning that they too had experienced the unshakable feeling of being watched down there. Others joked that I was letting old ghost stories get to my head. I tried to brush it off outwardly, but inside, doubt gnawed at my sanity. Was I imagining all of this? Were my nerves frayed from the continuous thunder of machinery on the production floor? Or was there something genuinely lurking in that basement, something that thrived in the darkness and fed on fear? One evening I had to stay late to organize incoming shipments. Most of the day shift had gone home. A skeleton crew remained, scattered across the massive building. I needed a specialized tool to calibrate a set of gauges, and of course it was stored in the basement. My stomach sank at the thought, yet I had no choice. I descended the steps slowly, each footstep echoing uncomfortably loud on the concrete. The corridor was even darker than usual, perhaps because the overhead bulbs were burning out. My flashlight beam wavered over corroded walls, pitted floors, and the cramped aisles filled with dusty shelves. About halfway in, I felt the first rush of cold air across my ankles. It was unseasonably chilly that evening, but this draft was unnaturally sharp, like an icy breath from something unseen. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought the battery would die. Then the beam stabilized, revealing the same labyrinth of metal racks and crates. As I turned a corner, my nostrils flared at the stench of burnt wires or old insulation. It was strong enough to make me gag, forcing me to cover my mouth. My pulse raced, and beads of sweat trickled down my temples, conflicting with the chill that penetrated the rest of my body. I aimed the flashlight at the far wall, scanning for the tool cabinet, when I detected the faintest movement behind one of the shelves. It was just a quick flicker of darkness that seemed to slip away as soon as the light hit it. My throat tightened. A trickle of adrenaline spurred me forward, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run. I had to confirm if someone was there. Maybe it was a coworker messing with me or a trespasser looking for scrap metal to steal. As I approached, I heard a soft scraping noise again, like nails or metal scraping gently across concrete. My flashlight's beam trembled as my hand shook. The corridor beyond the shelf extended into blackness, broken only by intermittent emergency lights that provided minimal visibility. I forced myself to move forward, stepping carefully over loose cables on the floor. Suddenly, the overhead bulb a few feet behind me blinked out, plunging that section of the basement into darkness. My heart pounded in my ears and my breathing became shallow, as if the air had thickened around me. I reached the tool cabinet and managed to find the item I needed. The metal handle felt unnaturally cold against my palm, sending a sharp jolt of unease up my arm. Then I heard a slow, deliberate creaking noise. It was coming from the far side of the basement, near a cluster of disused equipment. It almost sounded like someone pushing a heavy cart, but there were no other employees around. I wanted to call out, but my voice stuck in my dry throat. The silence stretched on, making the next subtle sound of movement all the more unnerving. Rounding another corner, I glimpsed the silhouette again. Only this time, it seemed more defined, as if I could almost make out the shape of shoulders and a head. It paused near a stack of old crates, then slid back behind them. My legs turned to jelly, and my stomach twisted in on itself. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt a rush of blood pulsing in my ears. That primal sense of being hunted filled me, urging me to leave at once. But I couldn't let it end like this. I needed to know if I was truly alone in that basement, or if something beyond my understanding was sharing the darkness with me. Stepping closer, I tried to shine my flashlight through the cracks between the crates. I saw only darkness and smelled a pungent, stale odor that made me shiver. My heart hammered against my ribcage, and my breath came in shallow bursts. The air felt denser, and I swear I could sense a presence just beyond the beams of light, observing me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then a sudden rush of movement from behind the crates caused me to stumble backward, and I dropped the tool I had come for. It clanged on the floor with a burst of echoing noise. For a moment I panicked, searching frantically with the flashlight for any sign of a tangible figure. I saw nothing. No person crouching behind the crates, no footprints on the dusty ground, no sign of a trickster coworker. Just the fading rings of sound from the dropped tool. My entire body felt weak, as though the adrenaline surging through my veins had sapped my strength. The rational part of me insisted I was hallucinating, that the stress of the job and the haunting tales had blurred my perception of reality. Another part, buried in primitive fear, insisted I was not alone. I retrieved the tool, trembling so badly I nearly dropped it again, and retraced my steps toward the exit. The wall seemed to close in around me, pressing in with an oppressive weight that made every step a labor. My mouth felt like sandpaper, and I was drenched in cold sweat. Time seemed to distort in that basement, turning a 5-minute walk into an agonizing journey that stretched on for an eternity. At one point I glanced over my shoulder and thought I caught a glimpse of that shape in the corridor behind me, drifting along in near silence. I couldn't make out any features, just the broad suggestion of a human form. My heart lurched, and a burst of icy terror shot through me, spurring me forward at a stumbling run. When I finally emerged back into the main level of the plant, I gasped for air as though breaking the surface after nearly drowning. My knees threatened to buckle, and I leaned against a wall, trying to steady myself. A coworker passing by asked in a concerned tone if I was feeling all right. I managed to mutter something about a headache before pushing past to reach my workstation. My hands shook for the remainder of the night, and I barely slept when I got home. The next morning I felt bleary and disoriented, replaying every moment of that encounter in my mind, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But the memory of that shifting silhouette refused to fade. Over the following weeks, the situation only grew more disturbing. I began to experience strange incidents even on the main floor, hearing faint footsteps behind me when I worked late, noticing my reflection in metal surfaces flicker oddly, as though something else was standing behind me. At times, I convinced myself it was stress manifesting as paranoid illusions. Then I would go to the basement to retrieve a part or tool and sense, with hair-raising clarity, that something was watching from the darkest recesses. The impression was so strong that goosebumps peppered my arms, and the fine hairs at the back of my neck prickled. Sometimes I smelled that same stale, metallic odor even upstairs, as if the basement was exhaling its presence into the rest of the building. I began to distrust my own senses, doubting every noise, every shifting shadow, every flicker of light in my peripheral vision. My productivity declined. Supervisors demanded I focus and maintain my usual efficiency, but I could hardly keep my mind on the job when the building itself seemed to conspire against my sanity. More than once I asked a coworker to accompany me to the basement, hoping that a second person would dispel the oppressive atmosphere. Usually they would only briefly join me, complaining about how unsettling it felt down there. We'd retrieve the necessary items as fast as possible and hurry out, hearts pounding. Once we returned to the main floor, they often brushed off the tension as an overreaction. But I noticed they became quieter, more introspective, as though they too had felt a sliver of the same terror. Gradually, I realized I had two choices: avoid the basement altogether and risk losing my job, or confront the situation head-on and reassert control over my own sense of reality. Late one afternoon, determined not to cower any longer, I made my way down there with a powerful flashlight, extra batteries, and a resolve to stay calm no matter what. The steps seemed steeper than ever. My breath echoed harshly in the confined space. I reached the bottom and squared my shoulders, determined to prove to myself that there was no tangible threat, only an aging storage area that had taken on the weight of too many rumors. I moved between the shelves systematically, shining the light into every corner, pushing aside crates, opening empty cabinets. The basement was silent except for the steady hum of the overhead lamps and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. After almost an hour of this fruitless search, I felt a slight relief. Nothing had moved. No footsteps had echoed. No silhouettes had darted away from my light. I began to believe I might have overestimated the situation, let my mind conjure horrors out of stale air. But then, at the far end of the room, I caught sight of the shadow again. It was different now, more defined, nearly solid in shape. It stood by the largest support pillar, like a silent figure draped in darkness. My heart seized up. Despite my fear, I walked closer, flashlight raised. The shape twitched, receding behind the pillar. I followed, stepping carefully, adrenaline igniting my veins. When I rounded the pillar, the space was empty. The shadow had vanished entirely. Yet the air felt electric, charged with an energy I could almost taste, like metal against my tongue. A scraping sound started up somewhere to my right, so I spun around, shining the beam along a row of stacked pallets. I saw nothing. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. My breath came in erratic bursts, and a cold, clammy sweat covered my skin. I began to back away, refusing to turn my back on that corner. Another clang reverberated through the basement, as if something metal had struck the floor. That was all I could endure. My courage shattered under the weight of the unknown. I fled toward the stairs, racing as fast as I could, heart pounding a frantic rhythm. Upon reaching the main floor, I stood there with trembling legs, struggling to collect myself. I realized I would never be able to explain this to anyone's satisfaction. Not my supervisors, not my coworkers, and not even to my own reflection in the bathroom mirror. The building itself seemed tainted, as though some lingering presence was woven into its rusting pipes and reinforced foundations. Whether it was a collective hallucination fueled by rumors, or a genuine entity that thrived on the fear saturating its decrepit walls, I did not know. But I did understand one thing. That basement was no ordinary storage space. Something there defied the boundaries of reason and insisted on making its existence felt. From that day onward, I avoided going down alone. Whenever a task demanded a part or tool from the basement, I made sure to bring at least one coworker with me, feigning the need for extra assistance. The tension in my muscles never fully subsided during those trips, and I could see the same tightness in my companions' expressions when the cold air seemed to brush past us unexpectedly, or when a random clatter echoed from behind the shelves. No one openly acknowledged the shared fear, but we all felt it. Even the most skeptical individuals left in haste, refusing to linger. I still work at the metal shop. The hum of machinery on the main floor remains my daily soundtrack, and the memory of that shifting shape in the basement persists like a stain I can't wash away. On certain evenings, when I walk past the door leading downstairs, I sense a chill emanating from below, as though the basement itself is breathing in the darkness. Sometimes I imagine that if I stand there long enough, I might hear the faint scrape of metal on concrete beckoning me back. I haven't worked up the nerve to descend alone since that last encounter, and I doubt I ever will again. Even now, when I recall the silhouette that vanished behind the pillar, or the footfalls that scampered away in the dark, a tremor of cold dread ripples through my core. The fear is a living thing, embedded in my psyche. I wonder if in truth it's not the basement that's haunted, but my mind that has been branded by something I can't understand. Part of me believes the presence is still there, lurking behind crates and shelves, stirring the stale air. Another part of me questions if it's all been an elaborate construction of my own anxiety, amplified by the gloomy confines of a decades-old industrial cavern. But in the end, it hardly matters what the logical explanation might be. The terror I felt was real. The sweat on my brow, the thunder of my heart, the paralyzing sense of being watched. None of that can be dismissed as mere fantasy. Whatever exists in that basement, real or imagined, has carved a scar deep into my thoughts. Each time I glance at that worn-down entrance, I feel an echo of the dread that consumed me, and I know I'll never again walk down those stairs with the same casual indifference I once had. That basement remains a place outside the comfort of reason, a pocket of darkness within the factory's old bones. And for me, its menace is far from over. I remember the first night I spent in that cramped house on the outskirts of town as if it were a knife pressing into my awareness, sharp and impossible to ignore. The moment I stepped inside, the stale air felt heavy on my lungs, making it difficult to breathe. A single flickering light bulb in the living room swayed from a short length of cord, and its weak glow barely illuminated the peeling wallpaper and stained floorboards. Even with the door closed behind me, I sensed something waiting on the other side, some presence that had been there long before I arrived. Perhaps it was only the exhaustion of the move, or perhaps it was the first undeniable signal that I was no longer alone. I had bought the small attached house with the hope of saving money. City living had become unbearable, and I needed something cheaper, something more private. Yet from the outside, the property looked cramped, with worn bricks that gave the impression the entire structure might collapse if you blew on it. The windows, old and clouded, didn't let in much daylight. Still, I signed the papers and lugged my belongings inside on a humid afternoon. My body already ached from hauling boxes up the narrow stairway to the attic bedroom, which had the only workable closet in the house. The first few hours were spent dusting and trying to make the place livable. At first, the neighbor next door barely registered in my mind. The walls were thin enough that I heard the sound of his television late at night, and I assumed he was just another reclusive older gentleman with little inclination to socialize. When I finally met him, he looked frail, with a stooped posture and a face etched by deep lines of worry, or perhaps fear. He wore the same gray sweater every time I saw him, and he peered out from behind a tattered curtain in his front window, as if watching for something to happen. The day I moved in, he stood on his porch and stared at me. I offered a small wave, but he only nodded, his eyes flicking from me to the roofline above our houses and back. Despite the uneasiness I felt, I tried to be courteous. One afternoon, while I was taking out the trash, he beckoned me over to his side of the small shared front yard. He spoke softly, voice trembling as he mumbled about things in the attic. He told me, in words that I found bizarre, that I should pray not to be disturbed by whatever roamed the space above us. At first, I brushed it off as superstition or perhaps senility. The entire conversation gave me goosebumps, though I couldn't be certain if it was because of his delivery or the content itself. Perhaps both. He rarely left his house, and when he did, he would shuffle to his mailbox with a hurried stiffness, then rush back inside. On the rare occasions we made eye contact, I sensed an unspoken alarm in him. My attempts at small talk felt futile. He spoke of a presence that enjoyed roofs, that liked to stalk the upper floors in the dead of night. I tried to remind myself that an old man in near isolation might develop strange beliefs, but my rationalization didn't stop the slight tremor in my hands whenever he mentioned it. Not long after, I began to notice the sounds. Late at night, as I lay in my bed, I would hear soft thumps above me, a kind of careful pressure on the ceiling that suggested something crawling around on all fours. The walls in that attic bedroom were so thin that I could make out every subtle shift. At times it was just a gentle scratch, 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 as if nails or claws were raking against the rafters. When I was drifting off to sleep, the faint scuttling sound made me jerk awake. My mouth went dry, and my heart hammered in my chest. The logical part of my mind kept insisting it must be rodents. The old man's words, however, lingered like an unwanted echo at the back of my thoughts. For a while I tried to ignore the noise, though it only got worse. Some nights, I felt the movement right above my bed, almost as if the ceiling would give way under the weight. I'd open my eyes in the darkness, straining to see the shape of anything overhead. All I ever found were faint outlines from the dim streetlight that filtered through the gap in my curtains. Still, the sensations persisted. Footsteps, brushing sounds, a slow, rhythmic tapping. Eventually, I confronted the neighbor. I went to his porch one evening to ask if he was messing around in his own attic. He spoke in a cryptic, hurried manner, explaining how it had grown more active, and that staying awake might be the only defense. His words made no sense to me, yet the intensity in his face was palpable. My body tensed with each breath. When I walked away, my footsteps felt heavy, weighed down by a dread that had no rational explanation. The more I tried to dismiss his warnings, the more the night terrors invaded my sleep. At around 3 a.m, I started hearing loud banging on the shared wall. My neighbor seemed to be pounding on it, sometimes shouting for me to stay awake. I'd sit upright in bed, heart thudding and sweat drenching my shirt. It felt as if the entire house was pulsating with anxiety. At times, when the pounding ceased, a hush would follow, so profound that even my shallow breathing sounded thunderous in my ears. In that silence, the scratching would begin again. Then one day, my neighbor vanished. For a time, I tried not to make assumptions. Perhaps he had gone to stay with relatives, or had gone shopping for groceries. But as the days dragged on without hearing his television or his repetitive shuffling footsteps, my uneasiness turned into dread. Through my window, I noticed that no lights were on in his home at night. The mailbox overflowed with leaflets and letters. I pressed my ear against the shared wall, waiting for some sign of life. Nothing. Only an empty hush, broken occasionally by the sound of my own breathing. I considered knocking on his door, but a tightness in my chest held me back. Something about that house gave me the same sort of feeling I'd get when peering down a dark alley in the middle of the night. It was an irrational fear, but it gnawed at me, urging me to stay away. My attempts to distract myself with daily routines, work, errands, minor home repairs, felt hollow. Every time dusk fell, I was left alone with that suffocating apprehension about the night to come. Even with the neighbor gone, the noises above continued, and, if anything, they grew bolder. More than once, I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I heard a dragging sound, as if something with a heavy body was sliding across the attic floor. My heart pounded so fiercely I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. I switched on every light I could, moving through the house in a near panic, flicking switches as if brightness alone would chase away whatever lurked in the shadows. The real terror set in when I noticed details I'd somehow missed before. In the far corner of the living room where the ceiling met the wall, there was a faint discoloration, almost like a damp spot. But this mark looked smudged, like something had rubbed against it repeatedly. The next day, I climbed onto a chair, pressed my fingers to the stained plaster, and felt a slight give. The drywall flexed under the pressure, too much for what should be solid. My pulse sped up, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine, as though the house itself recoiled from my touch. I wanted to investigate the attic, but just imagining going up there made my skin crawl. The retractable ladder squeaked ominously whenever I pulled it down, and the darkness at the top was as thick as ink, no matter how bright the afternoon sun. One afternoon, I forced myself to climb those shaky steps. I took a flashlight, heart drumming so hard that each step reverberated in my bones. The beam of light swept across broken boxes, dusty shelves, and a few tattered tarps. I didn't see any obvious footprints or the telltale droppings of animals, yet the entire place felt tight, claustrophobic, as if the walls were slowly closing in. A sense of being watched overwhelmed me so powerfully that my hands trembled, causing the flashlight to wobble. Shadows stretched and contorted across the attic beams in a way that made me feel nauseous. My breath caught in my throat, and I barely managed to swallow my fear and climb back down. Even after I descended, I felt as though something lingered near the opening, silently observing me. That night, exhaustion weighed on me, but anxiety refused to let me rest. The small lamp by my bed remained on, casting feeble light against the ceiling. I lay there, fully aware of every creak, every shift in the house's old structure. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and my palms felt slick against the sheets. Eventually, I dozed off, only to be jolted awake by the distinct sound of something scraping directly above the light fixture. I shot out of bed, eyes scanning the room in frantic confusion. In that split second, I saw a slight bulge in the ceiling, like the plaster had momentarily pressed downward. My heart nearly stopped. Then it was gone. The ceiling looked normal again, if one could call such an old, stained surface normal. My chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, and a numbness crept into my legs. I didn't sleep after that. In the days that followed, my thoughts spiraled. My neighbor's words reverberated in my mind. I began questioning if perhaps I was imagining the whole ordeal. Yet every night the sounds persisted. A thud here, a scuttling there. My reflection in the mirror revealed someone worn down. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and my lips were cracked from the constant dryness in my mouth. Even my coworkers asked if I was sick, noticing how jumpy I had become. I avoided discussing it, worried they'd think I was losing my grip. Desperate, I considered the possibility of a prowler or intruder using the attic space. I thought about calling the police, but I had no proof. The open attic was locked from my side, and no footprints or obvious forced entry were visible. The entire concept felt too outlandish to report. Each time I rationalized the plan, I imagined an officer standing in my living room, scanning the ceiling with a puzzled look, only to find nothing. I could practically feel the embarrassment of trying to explain a persistent presence that left behind no trace. To cope, I started placing bowls of water in random spots in the attic, hoping I might catch a footprint or see them disturbed. By morning, the water remained still, untouched by any visible movement. Yet at night, I still heard the same disturbing shuffles overhead. If I was losing my mind, it had chosen a particularly merciless way to torment me. Every time darkness fell, my pulse would skyrocket, and the hair on my arms stood on end, as if the atmosphere itself carried an electrical charge. As the nights dragged on, my fear morphed into a near certainty that I was being deliberately tormented. I would sit upright in bed, eyes glued to the ceiling, beads of sweat rolling down my temples. The faintest creak made me flinch. My breathing became shallow and my heart seemed to flutter like a trapped bird. I kept glancing at the phone, debating whether to call for help. But who would I call? A psychic? A ghost hunter? The mere thought made me feel ridiculous, and yet here I was, genuinely frightened of whatever lurked above my ceiling. One evening I heard a series of slow taps. They had a curious rhythm, almost playful, like someone drumming their fingertips in deliberate intervals. My stomach tightened into knots. I stood in my living room paralyzed, flashlight in hand, uncertain whether to climb up once more or flee the house altogether. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, raspy sound, like a dry breath against the beams. Sweat prickled the back of my neck. My knees threatened to buckle as I forced myself toward the attic ladder. I reached for the cord to pull it down, but my hand trembled so violently that I missed on the first try. Something beyond the ceiling boards dragged slowly across the attic floor, an agonizing scrape that might have been a single limb or an object being drawn along. Clutching the cord, I realized I couldn't go up there alone. Not anymore. I retreated to my bedroom and locked the door, though logically I knew that lock wouldn't protect me from anything above. Still, it felt marginally safer. I spent the night huddled on the bed with the lamp on, shivering each time the house creaked. By morning, I was delirious with fatigue, but also possessed by a singular determination. I had to leave. So I fled. I packed a small bag of essentials, then headed out the front door without even locking it. My heart wouldn't slow down until I reached my car. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to accelerate as I peeled away from the curb, tires skidding on the cracked asphalt. Once I hit the main road, I struggled to breathe. My vision blurred from the tears welling up in my eyes. Tears of shame, fear, and relief all tangled together. I ended up staying at a motel that night, the glaring neon sign from the parking lot shining through the thin curtains. The claustrophobic space was a far cry from comfortable, but the moment I closed the door, I felt a weight lift off my chest. There were no noises in the ceiling, no scratching, no tapping, just the faint hum of an ancient air conditioner. My pulse steadied, and for the first time in weeks, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Now I'm back on the road, driving away from that small house on the outskirts. I haven't decided if I'll try to sell it or if I'll simply let it decay in my absence. The neighbor never did reappear, and I refuse to set foot in that place again to investigate further. Sometimes I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that old man's silhouette or something else peering at me from the back seat. My mind plays tricks on me, and any little noise, a branch scraping against the side of my car or the sudden roar of a passing truck, makes my heart kick into high gear. I still don't know if the presence was real, or if my mind conjured it from the seeds of the neighbor's ominous words. Part of me wonders if, by leaving, I've only prolonged the inevitable, as though the thing that thrived above those bedrooms could follow me wherever I go. On certain nights, in my new rental place, I find myself wide awake at 2 or 3 in the morning, listening with an intensity that borders on paranoia. Each pop of the floorboards or rush of water through the pipes triggers a wave of apprehension. It's as though I can still feel the memory of that crawling, scuttling presence pressing down from above. Even now, recalling the bulge in the ceiling, the neighbor's frantic warnings, and the sense of eyes watching me from every corner of that attic, my hands grow clammy. My breath comes in uneven bursts, and my stomach twists into anxious knots. There's a relentless pulse of dread embedded in my consciousness, a reminder that sometimes it's not about ghosts or monsters in the usual sense. Sometimes the most horrifying thing is not knowing exactly what's lurking, only that it's there, unseen and unnerving, just a few thin boards away. I've come to accept that I might never find a concrete explanation. Yet I can't erase the image of that old man tapping the wall at night, urging me not to fall asleep, or the sensation of something heavy dragging itself just above my head. My mind keeps cycling through the same questions, but the answers remain elusive, locked in the shadows of a dusty attic I will never see again. If I'm left with one certainty, it's this. There are some places in this world where reality bends, where fear becomes a living, breathing force that thrives on isolation and neglect. Once you set foot inside, it doesn't quite let you go. And that's the real nightmare. That even if you manage to leave, a part of you remains behind in the darkness, under the roof that harbors unspeakable things, always listening, always waiting, and always just inches away above your head. A thin layer of unease clung to me the moment I crossed the threshold of that old hotel. The air tasted stale, and the hallways seemed to swallow the weak overhead light, leaving elongated shadows dancing on the walls. Something about the building felt inherently wrong, as though its walls held whispered secrets that pressed in close, begging to be heard. My skin prickled, and a persistent chill settled in my gut. I was exhausted from the road, but the heaviness in that place made my chest tighten as if warning me not to stay. I am a traveling salesman, driving from town to town, often seeing new places through bleary eyes after long days of client visits. Usually, I pick practical accommodations. Nothing fancy, just a bed, a functional shower, and ideally a decent breakfast. That night, I had planned to spend no more than 2 days in the area before continuing on my route. The hotel had been advertised as a family-owned establishment with affordable rates. The outside looked shabby but not alarming. Peeling paint, crooked signage, windows that didn't gleam but still looked intact. I convinced myself it would be good enough. I just needed to rest my head and wake up early to continue my work. I never suspected that place would cling to my memories like a dark stain I can't fully wash away. Upon check-in, I found the lobby deserted, except for one man behind the counter, presumably the owner. He hardly glanced up from a dog-eared magazine. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the soft buzzing of an ancient ceiling fan. My stomach knotted inexplicably as I filled out the guest register, its pages wrinkled and yellowed by time. The pen scratched across the paper with a grating sound that set my nerves on edge. I told myself I was just overly tired. After receiving a worn key, I climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor. Each step echoed down the narrow corridor, and it felt as if the building was holding its breath, waiting. The room itself was spare, a single bed, a small dresser topped with a cloudy mirror, and a cheap lamp that cast a weak, flickering glow. The walls were a sickly pale green, marred by stains of uncertain origin. The air smelled faintly of must and cleaning chemicals that couldn't hide the underlying odor. Immediately I noticed the door had a heavy metal doorknob, scuffed and scratched. My eyes lingered on it a bit too long, as if drawn by some instinct I couldn't name. I tossed my suitcase on the bed, trying to shake off the creeping discomfort that was already needling the back of my mind. I had an early morning ahead, and though the atmosphere was unsettling, I believed a night's sleep could reset my nerves. That hope began to crumble around midnight. I was struggling to drift off when I heard it. A gentle rattle. The doorknob to my room was moving, no mistaking the metallic clink. My heart gave a sharp jolt, and my breath caught in my throat. I lay there frozen, ears straining to confirm it wasn't just my imagination. But the sound persisted, soft at first, then a bit more insistent, as though someone was testing how secure the lock was. My pulse pounded in my temples. I fought the urge to call out. Instead, I slid out of bed, taking slow, cautious steps across the cold floor. The boards groaned under my weight. As I approached, I tried to focus on my breathing, deep and steady, or as steady as I could manage with every nerve in my body on high alert. Placing one eye against the peephole, I peered out into the hallway. There was nothing. Nobody stood outside. I waited for several tense seconds, expecting to see a figure step into view, but the corridor was empty and still. Only the distant flicker of the overhead light remained. Unease warred with the lingering adrenaline that coursed through my veins. I debated stepping out into the hallway, but finally decided it would be pointless. Maybe it had been a loose doorknob responding to a draft. I recalled older buildings sometimes had odd quirks, windows that let in breezes, floors that warped over time. Shaking my head, I returned to bed, though my heartbeat stayed elevated for a long time before exhaustion finally claimed me. The incident happened twice more that same night. Each time the doorknob rattled just enough to yank me from a light doze into a bolt-upright panic. Each time I peered out and saw nothing. By dawn, my nerves were raw. I felt worn down even before starting my workday. At checkout time, I approached the owner in the lobby and mentioned the strange rattling. He barely looked up, made a dismissive gesture, and muttered that it might have been the wind. He admitted it had happened before, then waved me off as if I were just another complainer. His indifference left an unpleasant taste in my mouth. My workday was grueling, involving back-to-back client visits across different neighborhoods. I was on my feet in dusty warehouses and dimly lit offices, discussing products and promotional packages. By the afternoon, a headache throbbed behind my eyes and my body ached. I briefly considered switching hotels, but the prices around that area were higher than I cared to spend for just one more night. Besides, I tried to reason with myself. It was probably nothing. But beneath that rationale, a sharp jolt of memory made my stomach churn, that distinct metallic jiggle of the doorknob in the dead of night. As evening approached, I grew increasingly uneasy about returning. Yet return I did, hoping that sheer exhaustion would override any lingering spookiness. The building felt more sinister after dark, with the corridors cloaked in deeper shadows. The overhead lights flickered erratically, as though they were on the verge of burning out. I caught a glimpse of the owner at the desk. He avoided my eyes this time, his lips pressed into a grim line. There was a momentary pang of regret that I had mentioned anything at all. His reaction added another layer of odd tension to the place, like I'd uncovered something he preferred to keep buried. On the second floor, I turned the corner toward my room and stopped short, heart drumming against my ribcage. At the far end of the hallway, I saw a man standing perfectly still, facing my door. He wore dark clothing and stood so eerily motionless that, for an instant, I wondered if he was just a shadow. The weak light outlined his figure, revealing only the edges of his body, broad shoulders, a stance too stiff to be natural. My breathing hitched, and I felt a cold slick of sweat forming at my temples. Summoning whatever courage I had left, I stepped forward, calling out a subdued greeting. The words echoed dully, but there was no reply. He turned the corner just as I neared, leaving me with a flash of his silhouette and an unsettling memory of his posture. I considered rushing after him, but my feet refused to comply. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, he was gone. There was no sign of footsteps, no door clicking shut, nothing. The only sound was my own labored breathing and the hum of the flickering light overhead. My legs felt wooden as I made my way back to my door. Something in the air radiated a thick anxiety that pressed down on my shoulders. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was making a mistake staying here another night, but I was too exhausted to find a new place so late. I slipped into my room, locked the door, and dragged the dresser in front of it, hoping that would be enough to ward off any intruder, or at least buy me time to react. The night that followed was one of the longest in my memory. I lay in the darkness, every sound magnified. The faint hum of the hallway light seeped through the door. My heart fluttered at the slightest creak of the old building settling. I tried in vain to steady my pulse, but every time I felt like I was close to drifting off, a new clatter would jolt me awake. Sometime after midnight, the doorknob began to rattle again, but this time more violently. It was not the subtle jiggling of the previous night. This was deliberate, forceful enough that I heard the metal scraping against the frame. My limbs turned rigid as I listened, every muscle tensing, adrenaline flooding me to the point of making me dizzy. I forced myself to slide out of bed, pressing my ear against the door. The rattling persisted, sending sharp jolts of fear through my chest. My throat felt parched, and my tongue felt thick in my mouth. I could barely swallow. Although my mind urged me to look through the peephole, my body refused. A raw terror told me it would be safer not to see whatever was out there. My palms broke out in a cold sweat, and for a moment, I was certain my heart would hammer right out of my chest. The rattling stopped suddenly, leaving an echo in my ears that felt more agonizing than the noise itself. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, ear pressed to the door, waiting for any further sign of activity. Eventually, fatigue and shaky relief mixed. I slid back into bed, but not once did I close my eyes for longer than a few seconds. I stayed alert, heart pounding painfully in my ribcage as the hours crawled toward morning. When weak sunlight finally filtered through the threadbare curtains, I rose on unsteady legs. My back ached, and the rims of my eyes burned from lack of sleep. Nonetheless, I gathered my things, determined to leave as quickly as possible. My hand trembled as I moved the dresser aside to open the door. Upon doing so, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The door's surface was marred by fresh scratches, long, jagged grooves etched into the wood as though someone had clawed at it. My stomach lurched, and I felt a wave of nausea. For several moments, I just stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of those markings. A part of me wanted to march downstairs and demand an explanation, to force the owner to admit something deeply wrong was lurking in that building. Instead, my limbs reacted on autopilot. I collected my bag in a vice-like grip and made my way down the corridor. My palms were sweaty, and my pulse refused to slow. I caught a glimpse of myself in a tarnished mirror on the wall. My face was pale, hair disheveled, eyes wide with apprehension. The reflection seemed almost unfamiliar. I forced my gaze away, feeling as though the mirror itself was accusing me of witnessing things that should have stayed hidden. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my breath ragged. In the lobby, the owner shot me a cold, disinterested look. He said something dismissive about the last night's events, hinting that odd noises were common and that I was overreacting. I barely registered his words through the haze of my urgency to leave. The tension in my chest felt suffocating, and I had an odd sense that time was both speeding and slowing around me. Without prolonging the exchange, I headed straight for the exit, ignoring the twist of disappointment in my gut that I would likely never get a clear explanation from him. Stepping outside was like surfacing from underwater. The morning air tasted fresher than I remembered. My heart pounded in my ears, yet I felt oddly liberated. The strangest detail remained those scratch marks. So deliberate, so unexplainable by mere wind or an old door's squeaky hinges. Everything about the hotel had felt cloaked in secrets, and the fact that I escaped without any physical harm should have brought relief. But a sense of lingering dread followed me as I got into my car and drove away, unable to shake the notion that something had been waiting on the other side of that door, intent on getting in. To this day, the memory gnaws at me. Sometimes on long stretches of highway late at night, I recall the hush of that hallway and the figure that stood at the far end, silently staring at my door. I remember the frantic jiggling of the knob, the spiderweb of scratches that greeted me in the pale dawn light. I can feel the cold sweat on my skin, the dryness in my throat, the heaviness in my chest. My rational mind demands I write it off as a bizarre set of coincidences or some malicious prank. Yet a deeper part of me remains convinced that I stumbled upon something far beyond a mere oddity. Even now, the recollection makes my skin prickle. My heart rate quickens, and a faint echo of that helpless panic returns. I've since found other hotels, most of them perfectly normal. But I never stay in buildings that remind me even vaguely of that place. Whenever I sense that familiar stale quality in the air, or see an outdated corridor bathed in flickering light, I remember the old hotel and the rattling doorknob. Then comes the question that always torments me. What if I had opened the door the second night? What might I have seen standing there, I never answered that question, and I don't think I ever will. The safest choice was to leave that building in my rearview mirror, to never challenge whatever force had tried to breach my room. Sometimes, in nightmares, I imagine returning to that hallway, only this time finding the corridor stretched into impossible darkness, the walls pressing in, and the door scratched beyond recognition. In those dreams, I raise the key to the lock, compelled to open it, but my hand shakes uncontrollably until the key falls from my grip. The sense of looming dread always wakes me before I can turn the knob. Then I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart hammering as if I'm still there. That is how deeply the experience cut into me. I never went back to that hotel, nor did I ever discover if others experienced the same terror behind their doors. All I know is that the place exists, unchanged in my memory, a flickering corridor of stale air, stale light, and something unseen patiently testing each door in the stillness of the night. My only consolation is that I escaped while I still could, my sanity bruised but intact. Yet on some nights, when sleep eludes me and shadows seem deeper than usual, I revisit that place in my mind. Even the memory feels suffocating, and I have to remind myself that I left. I got away, and I pray, in those dark hours, never to stumble upon such a place again. I remember the weekend retreat like a series of distorted snapshots, each soaked in dread. From the moment we arrived at that secluded property, something felt wrong. The air felt heavier than usual, as if charged with a silent warning meant only for us. I could sense it the instant I stepped out of the car, a tangible unease that prickled across my skin. Even the trees, gnarled and towering, seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking with an almost accusatory sound. It was as though the surroundings wanted us to reconsider our stay, to turn back before it was too late. But we were there for a relaxing escape, a brief break from city life, so the last thing on our minds was any thought of leaving early. I went with two close friends, Marcos and Daniel, men I trusted with my life. We had been invited to the site by an acquaintance who claimed it was perfect for hiking and stargazing, far from the noise of civilization. The main house itself was cozy, if a bit run down. The walls creaked at odd intervals, and the old wooden floors groaned under our steps. Yet we laughed off the ambiance at first, calling it rustic charm. We even joked about how the place felt haunted, but we made those jokes only to cut through the tension that none of us wanted to admit was growing. We each had our own bedroom, separated by narrow corridors, with doors that didn't quite close right. Every time I pushed mine shut, it would creak open a crack, as if curious about what I was doing inside. The first day was uneventful, aside from the oppressive heat and the occasional whiff of something rotten in the air outside. We shrugged it off, assuming it might be a dead animal somewhere in the surrounding woods. We had brought enough supplies for a long weekend: canned food, bottled water, flashlights, and some extra batteries. That first afternoon we grilled burgers and toasted the start of our getaway. By dusk we were all a bit tired from the drive, but we still ventured outside for a short walk. The path behind the house led to a patch of forest that grew denser with each step. I felt my pulse quicken as soon as we set foot among the twisted branches. The deeper we walked, the more certain I became that someone, or something, was watching us. On our second day, an almost overbearing curiosity compelled us to explore beyond the property's boundary. Marcos suggested we see what lay past the old fence at the back of the site. He had noticed it while scouting around in the morning. The fence was in disrepair, half collapsed in places, with rusted wire curling up from the ground. Beyond it, the land took on a wild, unkempt appearance. We saw thorny bushes, matted weeds, and crooked trees stretching out into the distance. Daniel noted that it looked abandoned, or at least untouched, for years. We climbed over the broken fence, carefully navigating the rotting wood posts that threatened to snap beneath our weight. Immediately, the air felt different, thicker and strangely stale, carrying a pungent smell I couldn't name. It was faint at first, like old incense left to burn in a closed room. We trudged through tall grass until we stumbled upon a ramshackle structure hidden behind a copse of trees. It looked like a crude shack assembled from mismatched pieces of timber. The roof sagged in the middle, and the walls were carved with strange, looping symbols. The door looked especially eerie, with a large symbol gouged into the center in a spiral pattern that made my head feel light if I stared too long. We stood there, hearts thudding in our chests, unsure whether to approach. The smell of bitter incense grew stronger the closer we got. Marcos muttered under his breath that it felt like a trap, but we could sense no sign of anyone living there. I carefully stepped forward, noticing how the wood beneath my feet seemed damp and spongy, as if I were standing on rotting planks. When I finally put my hand on the shack's door, I felt a surge of cold run up my arm. For a second, I imagined a deep hum vibrating from the old wood into my bones. Startled, I jerked my hand away. Daniel noted that we probably shouldn't go inside, and I found myself nodding along, relieved to have an excuse not to push the door open. We left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching us go. My stomach twisted in knots, and by the time we got back to the main house, my throat felt parched. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamed of standing in a dark forest clearing, hearing footsteps all around me, but never seeing who or what made them. At some point, in the dream, I found myself back at the shack, only to see the door wide open. A waft of that bitter incense smell hit me like a punch, and then the floorboards cracked beneath my feet. I woke in a cold sweat, heart hammering and breath coming in ragged gasps. A shuffle of movement in the hallway froze my blood. It sounded like bare feet brushing against the wooden floor. Gathering courage, I opened my bedroom door, but the corridor was empty. The only thing I heard was the old house settling, or so I tried to convince myself. In the morning, Marcos and Daniel both looked as if they hadn't slept a wink. They related, in hushed voices, that they had experienced similar dreams. Marcos mentioned hearing scratching sounds just outside his room. Daniel said he kept waking up because he felt something pressing down on his chest, pinning him to the bed. Neither could explain the sensation. Even talking about it set our nerves on edge. Attention weighed on us that morning, making us jump at any creak or sudden movement. Our appetites vanished, replaced by a persistent feeling of anxiety that made it impossible to focus on anything else. Later that day, I tried to gather more information about the shack. While the others sorted through the small library in the living room, I explored an old filing cabinet left behind by the property's previous owner. It was stuffed with yellowed documents and random newspaper clippings. Buried among them was a local news report, dated years ago, mentioning rumors of a nearby recluse who dabbled in unusual rituals. I read bits and pieces that referred to carved symbols and a pungent smell of incense. My pulse quickened as I made the connection. It had to be referring to that ramshackle structure beyond the fence. I showed Marcos and Daniel, and they exchanged nervous glances. We realized we had trespassed on a place tied to someone rumored to practice disturbing rites. That evening, the house grew colder, despite the hot summer air outside. It felt as if the walls themselves were exhaling chilly drafts. Whenever I entered a room, I had the unshakable sensation that I wasn't alone. Shadows in corners seemed to stretch and shift in my peripheral vision. My heart pounded so loudly that I sometimes wondered if the others could hear it. My mouth felt dry, my skin clammy. Whenever I tried to steady my breathing, it would falter as soon as I heard a tap or a distant thump. Though we stayed close, none of us felt comforted by each other's presence. We avoided returning to the shack that day, but it intruded on our thoughts relentlessly. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the carved door, the swirling markings, and that suffocating smell. My imagination conjured pictures of whoever had built it. I pictured a lone figure hunched over a wooden table, carving sigils with single-minded devotion. The idea of them being out there, hidden among the trees, made my chest tighten. Despite our best efforts to remain rational, the oppressive weight of fear twisted our perception of every sound and shadow in the house. On the third night, my nightmare escalated. In the dream, I was back at that shack, kneeling in front of the door, my hands pressed to the rough wood. My skin burned with a stinging cold, and the smell of incense choked me. Whispers circled around me, but I couldn't understand the words. They sounded guttural and strangely rhythmic, as if chanting in a forgotten tongue. When I glanced to my left, I saw a figure crouched beside me, face hidden by a hood. Despite not seeing its features, I felt it was staring directly into my eyes. When I tried to stand, the figure grabbed my wrist. Its touch seared my skin like ice. I jolted awake, gasping for air, the blanket twisted around my body like a straitjacket. A surge of panic clawed at my chest. My heart thumped so wildly I could hardly think straight. Footsteps clacked down the hallway, and I heard Daniel call out that he had heard knocking on his window. Marcos yelled from his room that he felt someone tug at his sheets. Each of us, in our own rooms, was overwhelmed by the feeling that something was drawing nearer and nearer, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. I got out of bed, unsteady and trembling, my entire body coated in cold sweat. The hallway's overhead light flickered ominously. My legs felt rubbery, and my throat was bone dry. When I finally managed to speak, my voice came out in a hoarse croak. I suggested we gather in the living room, not daring to stay alone any longer. We ended up sitting there, wide awake, well past midnight, jumping at every groan and shiver of the house. By morning, a gray drizzle of rain set in, turning the area into a damp, suffocating stretch of fog. We agreed, without much conversation, that we needed to leave early. The sense of impending doom gnawed at us, making the prospect of one more night there unbearable. As we were packing, Marcos mentioned that he felt compelled to return to the shack before we left. Daniel looked horrified, and I felt torn. Part of me wanted to get as far away as possible, to forget we had ever crossed the fence, but another part of me needed closure. I wanted to see that place one last time, to prove to myself it was simply an abandoned, rotting shack and nothing more. We decided to go together, hoping to face our fear head-on. The morning light was pale and sickly, and the drizzle made the entire property look like a washed-out photograph. A sense of foreboding grew in my stomach as we approached the fence. Once again, the moment we stepped onto the other side, that bitter incense smell enveloped us. My heart hammered against my ribcage. Adrenaline coursed through me, making my breath shallow and fast. When we found the shack, I noticed something I hadn't before: small wooden talismans hanging from the edges of the roof. Each talisman bore a carving matching the symbol on the door. I felt my skin crawl as we drew closer. The door stood ajar this time, creaking softly in the damp air. I froze. Had we left it open? None of us could recall actually opening it on our first visit. My vision blurred for an instant as I tried to focus on the dark interior. The smell intensified, burning my nostrils and tightening my chest. Then I noticed movement inside, a faint shuffle, like cloth sliding over wood. We all stiffened, exchanging terrified glances. A spike of alarm shot through me, and I considered bolting back to the house. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a mix of horror and morbid curiosity. We never dared to cross the threshold. Instead, we inched backward until we were certain we were out of sight. My body trembled so violently that I had to clench my fists to keep control. Each step away felt like a small victory over the terror clawing at my mind. By the time we reached the fence, I could barely breathe, my mouth parched and my fingertips icy. We rushed back to the main house, flung our bags into the car, and left without looking back. Even now, I can't fully explain what we experienced. It was more than a fear of some dilapidated hut. Something in that place seemed to resonate with a sinister force I can't put into words. The nightmares continued for weeks afterward, always pulling me back to the musty smell of that incense, the swirling carvings, and the sense of being pinned in place while unseen eyes watched. I found myself double-checking the locks in my apartment at night, scanning every shadow for a hint of movement. My heart would race at the slightest noise. For months, I had the distinct feeling that I brought some of that darkness back with me, as if it clung to my psyche, determined not to let go. I still think about those nights in that old house, the dreams that blurred into near delirium. I can't shake the memory of pressing my hand against the shack's door, the freezing jolt that shot up my arm. Sometimes I wonder if it was an echo of whatever rituals were performed there, lingering in the wood and the earth, feeding off the fears of anyone who got too close. The worst part is that none of us can be entirely sure what we saw. Did we glimpse someone moving inside that shack, or was it a trick of our strained minds? Were those footsteps in the hallway just the creaking of an ancient floor? Or did something pace outside our bedroom doors at night, waiting for an invitation to step inside? Even years later, whenever I think about those carved symbols, impossible loops and lines that seem to dance under my gaze, I feel an aching pressure in my chest. My pulse quickens just recalling it, and a heavy dread washes over me. The memory resurfaces at odd moments. When I catch the smell of strong incense in the air, when I see a distorted reflection on a wooden surface, when I wake from a dream and can't shake the sense that someone is standing by my bedside, watching me breathe. I haven't returned to that property. I doubt I ever will. The thought of revisiting the site, especially that shack, makes my stomach twist with anxiety. Yet part of me remains curious, almost lured by the mystery of it all. I suppose fear has a way of drawing you back to the source, daring you to confront whatever lurks in the darkness. But I've decided some things are better left undiscovered. Certain places wear their malevolence on their sleeves, and no amount of logic or courage can erase the feeling that something unknown is waiting just beyond the threshold. In the end, we escaped unscathed physically, but none of us truly left that weekend behind. It lingers in our nightmares and unsettles us in quiet moments. That silent terror, the sibilant whispers we heard at night, the slow circling of footsteps around our rooms, those experiences carved themselves into our minds, much like the symbols on that battered door. No one died, no one vanished, yet the impact was undeniable. Even if the shack stands empty and forgotten among the trees, it lives on in our memories, a testament to the unnerving power of the unknown. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I can still smell that bitter incense creeping in at the edges of my awareness, reminding me that some secrets are never truly laid to rest. I remember the night it all changed. The apartment was still, every surface cloaked in stale air, and yet I felt a presence, an intangible weight pressing in on my chest. It was like walking into a neglected chapel where the silence had mutated into something alive. I knew in my gut that I was not alone, even though the place was technically empty. That realization hit me like a deep chill, rooting me in place, my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel the blood pulsing behind my eyes. This was the first moment I understood that my life had taken a dark turn, and nothing felt safe anymore. When I moved into that apartment, I had been a skeptical college student, convinced that anything supernatural was pure fiction. My roommate, let's call him Mateo, introduced himself with a half smile and a casual mention that he practiced astral projection. I brushed it off as a quirky detail, the way someone might say they liked collecting vintage postcards. At most, I assumed it was some kind of meditation. He sometimes mentioned drifting out of his body late at night, hovering just below the ceiling, seeing the entire city from above. I would shrug, maybe nod politely, and then steer the conversation toward more mundane topics. He never seemed offended. He merely stated these things like a matter of routine. During our time living together, I rarely noticed anything unusual. The apartment was old, with creaky floors and a sagging ceiling, but nothing screamed haunted house. The single corridor that connected our rooms to the small living area was poorly lit, the overhead bulb dimmer than it should have been. This lent the hallway a perpetual half-light that sometimes made me squint. Mateo seemed to like it that way. He once told me that dim spaces helped him focus when he attempted his astral journeys. I didn't argue, though I remember feeling uneasy at times when I walked down that hallway at night. Eventually, Mateo left. He completed his studies a semester before I did, and he found a job in another city. The night he moved out, the apartment felt unnaturally quiet, as if the walls were holding their breath. I convinced myself it was just the absence of another person's presence. No ambient chatter, no subtle movements in the next room. But that same night, I first heard a soft tapping against my bedroom wall. It was rhythmic, like someone was knocking just once every few seconds. I assumed it was the plumbing or maybe a branch brushing against the brick outside. The sounds didn't exactly scare me. They just annoyed me enough to keep me awake. Days passed, and I still heard the tapping at night, often near my bed. Sometimes after I turned off the lights, I felt as though a faint breath trickled across my ear, like a distant exhale that made the tiny hairs on my neck stand upright. My mind tried to rationalize everything. Old pipes, shifting wood beams, random gusts of wind sneaking through the gaps in the windows. Yet, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. I started sleeping with a small lamp on, telling myself it was just easier to find my phone if it rang late at night. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the apartment, I stumbled upon an old spiral notebook on Mateo's former desk. I had missed it somehow when he packed his things. The cover was worn, the edges curled, as if it had been handled many times. I flipped it open without hesitation, expecting maybe some class notes or personal doodles. Instead, I saw bizarre sketches of circles, strange symbols arranged in complex patterns, and lines that wove around each other in a mesmerizing design. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, with phrases that looked like codes or ciphers. I made out a few words in plain English, references to projection, night watchers, and shadows beyond the veil. The moment I scanned those pages, a sudden wave of vertigo crashed over me. My surroundings seemed to tilt, like the room was tipping on its axis. The corners of my vision darkened, and for a second, I lost my balance. In that instant, I sensed movement in the hallway, a shadow crossing from one wall to the other, impossibly fast and silent. My heart hammered, and I snapped the notebook shut. Breathing hard, I gripped the desk to steady myself. The sensation subsided, but a deep feeling of dread lingered. My instinct was to throw the notebook away, but some irrational part of me feared it might be a terrible idea to simply discard it. Instead, I stuffed it into the back of a closet, shoving it behind a stack of old textbooks, telling myself I would deal with it later. That night, the tapping sounds grew louder. Before I fell asleep, I noticed the bedroom door seemed to shift slightly, as if a draft moved it, but the windows were closed. My hands felt clammy, and my pulse raced. I tried to ignore the sensations, but I couldn't deny that something was wrong. In the darkness, my breaths felt too loud, echoing in my head. I woke up at odd intervals, convinced I heard low whispers, though I couldn't decipher a single word. The air seemed thick, oppressive, making me sweat despite the mild temperature. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. The soft tapping became more insistent, sometimes punctuated by 3 or 4 consecutive knocks. On 2 occasions, I felt what could only be described as a brush of cold air passing right over my face. It reminded me of someone leaning in close, breathing in my direction. I'd jolt awake, adrenaline spiking, and switch on the lamp. Of course, no one was there. My nerves were frayed. My hands trembled when I tried to read for class, and I found myself double-checking locks and windows, making sure everything was secure. At one point, I texted Mateo to ask if he had forgotten anything that might be causing me problems. He replied politely that he'd left only a few personal items and that I could keep or toss them as I wished. He never mentioned the notebook, and I didn't bring it up. I also thought about contacting the landlord. But what would I say? That the walls knocked at night and that I sensed a phantom presence. It sounded insane, even to me. The next weekend, I mustered the courage to examine the notebook more closely. I reasoned that maybe if I understood what it was about, I could put my fears to rest. In broad daylight, I retrieved it from the closet. My body felt tense, but I forced myself to open the cover again. The pages were filled with diagrams, large circles with smaller crescents inside, symbols that looked vaguely astrological. and odd words scribbled in the margins. Some were in English, referring to gateways and planes of existence. Others seemed to be in languages I couldn't recognize at all, maybe a mix of Latin or something even older, but it was hard to tell. As I turned the pages, I noticed my breath growing shallow. My palms were slick with sweat, and my head started to throb with a dull pain right behind my forehead. I tried to scan the text for anything that resembled an explanation. Fragments of instructions talked about leaving one's physical body, traveling through spaces between worlds, and warding off or inviting invisible guides. It was overwhelming and deeply unsettling. There was a sense that these pages were not just random scribbles, but a methodical effort at bridging two realms. A phrase scrawled at the bottom of one page read, "They watch when you open the door." My chest tightened at the implication that maybe, inadvertently, something had been let through. At that point, I slammed the notebook shut, the words still burning in my mind. My reflection in the desk's glossy surface looked pale, with dark circles under my eyes. As the afternoon wore on, a restless anxiety took hold of me. I made a quick decision. I could not keep that notebook around. I would destroy it. The next morning, I took the notebook to the small backyard area behind the kitchen. There was a rusted metal sink set up for rinsing out mops and such. I turned on the faucet for a moment, more out of nervous habit than anything else, then shut it off. My heart was racing, and I felt a twist of nausea in my gut. But I lit a match and set the corner of the notebook on fire. The flame hesitated, then crawled across the cover and began to devour the pages, turning them into dark, curling ashes. My eyes stung from the smoke, but I stood there until the entire thing was reduced to charred bits, which I then washed down the drain. A sense of relief washed over me, but a small part of me trembled, uncertain about what I had just done. Over the next few days, the tapping subsided. I no longer woke to strange breathing sounds, or felt that alarming cold brush against my face. But an odd tension lingered in the apartment, like a presence behind a thin veil. I couldn't say I was being haunted in the traditional sense. No objects moved on their own, no lights flickered. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation that something was still in the corners, watching me. My heart would flutter when I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the darkened windows at night. I'd noticed the faint outline of my own silhouette, but for a split second, it appeared that there was another shape next to it, something elongated and indistinct. Whenever I turned around, nothing was there. Sleeping became easier but not restful. Nightmares infiltrated my dreams. In them, I floated through the apartment, drifting just below the ceiling like Mateo said he used to do, only to see myself lying in bed, eyes open. And behind me, behind my sleeping body, something loomed, an inky silhouette with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. In these dreams, I couldn't scream or wake up. I only floated, trapped in that surreal vantage point, forced to watch as the shadow curled closer. When I finally jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, I would stare around the room, searching every corner for signs of movement. Even in daylight, paranoia tailed me. I kept thinking about the phrase, "They watch when you open the door." Maybe, by reading the notebook, I had opened something. I tried to dismiss the notion, but it gnawed at me. The rational side of my mind insisted I was just scaring myself with nonsense. The more anxious, superstitious side argued that I had seen real evidence of something beyond ordinary explanation. My breath would quicken whenever the lights flickered, or I heard a board creak underfoot. Often my hands shook when I tried to unlock the front door in the evening, afraid of what might greet me inside. After about a week of this torturous vigil, I found myself in the living room late at night, determined to confront my fears. I sat there with all the lights on, focusing on the hum of the refrigerator and the faint traffic noise outside, reminding myself that I lived in a normal world governed by normal rules. The minutes ticked by without incident, until I convinced myself that the worst had passed. I leaned back on the couch, exhaling a long breath. For the first time in days, my heart felt steady. Then a soft, nearly imperceptible knock resounded from the corridor wall. My spine tensed, a ripple of dread traveling up my neck. The knock sounded again, delicate yet unmistakable. It came from the direction of my room, exactly where I had heard it before. I stood, my mouth dry, and took a few shaky steps down the hallway. The overhead light flickered once, a gentle stutter that caused my stomach to twist. I could see my bedroom door, half closed, and the darkness beyond it. For a second, I thought I saw something shift in the gap between the door and the frame, like the movement of a tall figure sliding out of view. My body was covered in a thin sheen of sweat. Every instinct told me to back away, but I moved forward, my breath ragged, hoping to prove to myself that this was just a hallucination born of stress. When I finally reached the door, I pushed it open. The room was dark, the faint glow from the hallway light casting elongated shadows across the bed. Nothing seemed out of place. I approached the wall where I had heard the knock, placing my palm flat against the cool plaster. No further sound came, yet I felt an undercurrent of energy, a subtle vibration that made my hand tremble. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the dim space until my nerves forced me to retreat. Since then, I have tried to ignore the occasional soft knock or fleeting shadow in my peripheral vision. I tell myself I must be imagining things, that my mind is playing tricks after the stress of that bizarre notebook. The direct disturbances are far less frequent now, almost muted, as if whatever has lingered is content to remain at the edges of my awareness. Sometimes, when I'm studying at my desk, I feel that pressure in the air behind me, like someone leaning over my shoulder. My spine tingles, and goosebumps rise along my arms, but I don't look back. I graduated and found a different place to live not long after, but there are nights when I can't sleep. The memory of those nights in the apartment looms, along with the burning notebook and the sense that something was released, or at least noticed me. In quiet moments, I wonder if Mateo ever truly left. Perhaps in one of his projections, he brought something back, something that liked the feeling of being near people who still doubt the unseen. And when the darkness in the new place occasionally presses in, forcing my heart to pound like a drum, I suspect it has followed me. I have no proof of anything beyond the ordinary, no photographic evidence, no recordings of those knocks. But my fear doesn't require proof. It lingers in the corners of every dimly lit room, in the hush that descends just before sleep takes over. Even now, I sense a presence behind me as I write, as though a quiet observer stands guard in the shadows. I do not know if it will ever vanish completely. All I know is that I never had to believe in any of it for it to happen. That realization alone is enough to keep my nerves on edge, long after the tapping stops and the lights go out. I noticed the unsettling silence the moment I stepped out of my car. The wind had died, and the insects that usually buzzed around the lamp near the guard booth seemed to have vanished, as though repelled by some invisible force. Even before my shift officially started, something felt wrong. It was the kind of sensation that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end, the kind that creeps under your skin and sets your heart pounding before you can even identify the threat. When I opened the creaking door of the security booth, the walls themselves seemed to press inward, amplifying every breath I took. I told myself I was just jumpy, but deep down I knew it was more than that. I had a job to do, and I couldn't let my mind play tricks on me. Not yet. I work as a night security guard in a parking lot that belongs to a company on the outskirts of town. It's not the kind of place that's usually alive with activity, especially after sunset. Most employees leave by 6 or 7 in the evening, and after that, I'm the only person for miles, stuck between a row of parked cars and a fence that separates the company's property from an overgrown field of tall grass. During the day, it's just an expanse of green swaying in the wind. At night, however, those blades look like figures rising against the darkness, shifting in ways that never feel entirely natural. A few weeks ago, something happened that turned my regular shift into a waking nightmare. I remember it clearly. It was the beginning of the week, and I'd just arrived to clock in. The sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and purple as if the sky itself were bruised. I was heading over to the booth with a cup of coffee in one hand and my keyring in the other when I noticed movement beyond the fence. At first, it was just a shape, tall, human-like, standing perfectly still among the grass. He was facing the row of cars, unmoving. If I hadn't turned my head at the exact moment the last rays of sunlight caught his outline, I might have never realized he was there. I called out, trying to sound authoritative, but also not wanting to scare the person. There was no response. I had to decide whether to investigate or alert someone. I had no reason to think it was anything other than a trespasser planning to steal from the parked vehicles. When I took a few steps toward the fence, the figure slipped deeper into the brush, disappearing so quickly that it made my heart skip a beat. By the time I reached the chain-link barrier and pointed my flashlight over the swaying grass, there was no one to be found. I waited, shining the beam in wide arcs, half expecting to see eyes peering back at me. All I saw were vague shapes of tall grass bending in the breeze that had just started up again. It left me uneasy, but there was no sign of intrusion. When I did a routine check of the cars, nothing was missing or tampered with. After that brief scare, I tried to convince myself it might have been a homeless man looking for a place to camp, or maybe just some teen messing around. I shook off the fear and began my shift, though the memory kept me on edge through the night. The next few nights, things started to escalate in subtle ways. It began with a peculiar whistling sound. It was the kind of slow, drawn-out whistle you might hear if someone were signaling from far away, a lonely note that stretched across the empty field and made the hairs on my arms stand upright. The first time I heard it, I jumped from my chair inside the booth. The pitch was so clear and directed that it felt personal, as if whoever was out there was calling to me specifically. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest every time it echoed through the fence. I remembered telling a coworker, in a brief conversation at the end of one shift, that there was some weird whistling going on at night, but the coworker just shrugged and suggested it might be an animal, or even the wind. I wasn't convinced. The sound was too human, carrying an odd sense of intention. Every time I stepped out to investigate, I saw quick movement in the corner of my eye, an outline that vanished the instant my flashlight hit it. The grass would sway aggressively, as if someone just crashed through it. Yet whenever I swung the beam around, I found nothing. My heart would be pounding so loudly I could hear the rush of blood in my ears, and I'd catch myself clenching my teeth until my jaw hurt. I attempted different tactics to catch whoever was out there. One night, I tiptoed to the edge of the fence with my flashlight turned off, hoping to stay hidden. My breath was shallow and my palms were clammy against the flashlight's grip. I heard that low whistle again, so close it sounded like it was coming from behind my left shoulder, but when I spun around, no one stood there. I'd get these flashes of movement in my peripheral vision, small glimpses of a silhouette crouching or slinking closer. My heart pounded so fiercely that I worried I might pass out. I'd raise the flashlight in a sweep, and the shape would be gone. These events wore me down psychologically. By the end of each shift, I was shaking so badly that I could hardly get my keys to fit in my car's ignition. I started dreading the sunset. The quiet moments inside that lonely booth became suffocating. The only source of light, a single overhead lamp, flickered sometimes, causing shadows to warp across the walls. My imagination got the better of me. I began to wonder if I was truly seeing a person, or if it might be something else, something I didn't want to name. One evening, after hearing the whistling grow disturbingly close, I decided to walk around the perimeter of the parking lot. The area around the fence was dim, and my flashlight illuminated only a small circle in front of my feet. Every rustle in the nearby grass made my spine tingle. The combination of adrenaline and fear was making me sweat profusely, even though the night air was cool. My breathing became rapid, and the goosebumps on my arms felt as though they might never subside. I circled the fence slowly, forcing myself to check every stretch of chain link. About halfway around, the whistling stopped abruptly, as if it had been severed by a knife. A hush blanketed the night. I'd grown so accustomed to that eerie whistle that its sudden absence was almost worse. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and every exhalation sounded ragged, like I'd sprinted a mile. Then I heard it, a faint, dragging noise coming from inside the tall grass. It was a slow scrape against the ground, like someone pulling a heavy sack over the dirt. The sound drew closer, and I felt a primal, icy terror spread through my limbs. My stomach tightened, and the taste of copper filled my mouth, as if I'd been biting the inside of my cheek without realizing. I wanted to run back to the booth, but my legs felt like lead. Each step I took seemed too loud, crunching gravel underfoot. I strained to see what was creeping in the grass, but my flashlight beam revealed nothing beyond a few inches of swaying blades. Yet the sound continued, methodical and deliberate, inching closer. My skin prickled, and I could sense that something was staring at me from the darkness. The sensation of being watched burned into the back of my skull, as though a pair of eyes were locked onto my every move. With a trembling hand, I aimed the flashlight at the fence. Suddenly, I caught the briefest glimpse of a shape beyond it, a tall, elongated figure leaning between the grass. The moment the light touched it, it recoiled into the shadows, like a spider scuttling away from an open flame. A chill swept over me, and I could barely catch my breath. My chest tightened painfully, and I had to force myself to keep moving rather than collapse into a panic. I backed away, step by agonizing step, my throat dry and my eyes watering from the tension. The dragging noise grew fainter, then stopped. A suffocating silence fell, broken only by my ragged breathing. Once I reached the safety of the guard booth, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking so violently it took me several tries to engage the lock. I sank into my chair, numb with dread. It was almost 3 a.m, hours away from sunrise, and I felt trapped in that suffocating booth, pinned down by my own paranoia. The hours seemed to crawl. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of the light above, sent jolts of anxiety through my body. I kept imagining that figure creeping around the perimeter, tapping on the walls or pressing its face against the windows. I remember thinking that if I looked up, I might see it peering at me through the glass. A nauseating dread filled my stomach, and I felt sweat trickling down the back of my neck. Every so often I'd force myself to peek outside, just to confirm there was no one standing inches away from the door. Each time, the lot stood empty, lit by a pale glow from the overhead lamps, but the tall grass beyond remained an impenetrable wall of darkness. My shifts continued with similar, though not always identical, harassments. Sometimes the whistle was faint and intermittent. Other nights, it was loud, insistent, as if calling me out. I tried reporting it to my supervisor indirectly, mentioning that there might be someone lurking around, but nothing came of it. The next day, the fence would be checked, and no evidence of tampering was found. The cameras installed near the entrance showed nothing but static or empty frames. I wondered if I was losing my mind, imagining these events under the pressure of monotony and isolation. Still, my gut insisted that what I was experiencing was real. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. My mind started playing tricks on me, turning shadows into shapes and faint breezes into whispered voices. Some nights, I felt so unsteady that I'd hold my breath, listening intently for any clue that I wasn't alone. When the whistle came, a part of me almost felt relief, because it confirmed that I wasn't hallucinating. Then the dread would settle in again, and my chest would tighten as I realized this was no mere figment. In an attempt to regain some control, I told myself to face the fence once more. I planned to stand there, to confront whatever was lurking beyond, to at least prove I wasn't at the mercy of my own imagination. So I left the booth earlier than usual, feeling the cool night air sting my sweaty skin. My heart was pounding, but I gripped my flashlight and steeled my nerves. The parking lot was dead silent. Even the usual chirp of night insects had vanished. I reached the fence line and peered through the chain links. The grass swayed, gently at first. Then it parted, as though something was moving closer. My entire body tensed. My muscles felt ready to spasm from the sheer strain of anticipation. I raised the flashlight, and that was when the whistling died mid-note. The dragging noise started again, slow, scratchy, and purposeful. It was heading in my direction, and I felt my limbs seize up. Everything in me screamed to run, but I was momentarily frozen. There was no wind, No other sound, just that hideous scraping. I felt my breaths turn shallow, and my pulse throbbed in my neck. Fear swallowed me whole. Mustering all my will, I took a few clumsy steps backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My vision swam, and black spots appeared at the edges of my sight. I managed to break my paralysis enough to turn around and hurry back to the booth. Once inside, I bolted the door and pressed my back against it, sliding down until I was crouched on the floor. My entire frame shook, and cold sweat coated my forehead. The dragging noise continued for what felt like a small eternity, circling, scraping, always just beyond the fence. Then, as suddenly as it started, it ceased. I stayed in the booth until dawn. The darkness outside felt like it was alive, pulsing with intent. Whenever I mustered the courage to look out the window, the lot seemed so still, it was almost surreal. Eventually, the faint glow of morning lit the horizon. I stepped out of the booth, half expecting to see footprints or evidence of a break-in. There was nothing. The company employees started arriving, greeting me with casual nods while I tried to keep my expression neutral, concealing the turmoil within me. That was the last time I heard the dragging noise, but the memory of it haunts me. Even now, when I work a shift, I sometimes catch myself scanning the fence for movement, or holding my breath when the breeze rustles the grass. The whistle occasionally returns, distant and mournful, though never as close or as deliberate as before. I keep telling myself it's just my imagination, just a random swirl of night sounds combining to form something that seems menacing. But deep down, I sense that whatever I encountered still lurks among the grass, biding its time. I can't explain it rationally, and maybe I'm not meant to. I only know how it felt. Like stepping to the edge of a great void, aware that there's something waiting to pull you in if you lean too close. Every silent minute spent in that booth after midnight feels like borrowed time, as if I've been allowed to see the smallest fraction of something far more terrifying than I can comprehend. I haven't quit my job, though I've come close. My nights are ruled by tension and a raw, uncontrollable fear. And in the depth of that suffocating darkness, I can sometimes sense the presence beyond the fence, a reminder of how fragile the veil between reality and the unknown can be. It leaves me with a single, haunting question. Am I guarding an empty lot, or am I standing watch over something else, something that watches back? Even after countless nights of confrontation, I have no answer. Yet the discomfort settles in my chest every time the sun goes down, an insistent pulse that warns me not to forget. I haven't shared my story with anyone who truly believes me, but that's fine. Belief isn't what keeps me awake at night. It's that lingering certainty that one night, the whistle may not stop, and the dragging sound might cross the fence. The only truth I'm left with is that fear, like a living creature, can thrive in the darkness. And whatever was out there, it taught me one thing. Not every unknown force needs to take a life to leave you shattered. Sometimes, simply knowing it's there is enough to break you piece by piece. I remember the moment the hairs on my neck stood on end, like an electric current running through my body. It was past midnight, and I was alone in the old restaurant, finishing my daily balancing of the cash register. The ancient wood of the floors creaked in protest with every shift of my weight. But something else was stirring overhead, an unsettling whisper of movement that should not have been there. That night was the first time I felt certain I was not alone in that building. Even though the dining area had long been emptied, even though the second floor was supposedly locked tight, I heard footsteps pacing above me, as if some restless presence refused to let go of this place. I work as a barman in a historic restaurant that was once a warehouse decades ago. The massive wooden beams, thick stone walls, and old-fashioned gas lantern fixtures give the interior a heavy, oppressive air that many customers mistake for quaint charm. But late at night, after all the chatter and clinking of glasses have died down, the weight of the structure seems to press in on me from all directions. It feels as though the old walls, battered by time, hold remnants of other eras, other secrets, and perhaps other energies not quite willing to pass on. I usually finish cleaning and bookkeeping before closing time so I can leave with the rest of the staff. But sometimes the night takes unexpected turns. A larger crowd than anticipated, or a mismatch in the register that takes forever to reconcile. On one such night, I found myself alone after the lockup. My last coworker quietly mentioned, with a dry humor, that I shouldn't stay too late, or I'd start hearing those phantom footsteps. There was no teasing glint in her eyes, just a solemn warning, half in jest, half in earnest. Then she locked the front door behind her, and I was left in the dim glow of the emergency lights. At first, I tried to ignore every sound. Old buildings have a symphony of creaks, moans, and sighs that mean nothing, just timber settling or pipes shifting with changes in temperature. But these footsteps were steady, deliberate, and uncanny in their timing. They would start in the far corner of the second floor, where, as far as I knew, no one had set foot in years, then move slowly above me. My heart pounded, as if trying to warn me. Something is up there. I felt my pulse thumping in my throat. My breathing quickened and came out in shallow bursts. I wiped sweat from my brow and muttered to myself that it had to be my imagination. But the footsteps continued in a slow, unhurried pace. They made my skin tingle, as if ice water were flowing beneath the surface. Finally, I forced myself to focus on finishing my tasks. I clutched the pen in my hand so tightly my knuckles turned white, scribbling numbers into the ledger while the footsteps echoed above. Once I'd tallied everything, I practically sprinted out the door without looking back. Over the next few nights, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. It was easier during busy evenings when conversation and orders poured in non-stop, distracting me from any unwelcome thoughts. Yet each time I stepped behind the bar, an underlying sense of unease churned in my gut, as if the building's atmosphere had shifted somehow. My coworker asked if everything was fine. I told her indirectly about the strange noises I heard. She shrugged and said, "Everyone who works the late shift feels there's something upstairs, but no one knows exactly what it is." She advised that if I ever had to stay past midnight again, it might be better just to finish up and leave quickly. But curiosity can be a potent thing. A part of me wanted to explain those footsteps rationally, to find a natural cause or a trick of acoustics, so I could banish this gnawing dread that had me on edge every time I looked at the ceiling. And so, a few days later, I had another late shift. The restaurant was mostly empty by 11. By midnight, the last of the staff had left. As soon as I heard those methodical steps above me, a chill seized my chest. Yet I resolved to investigate. My own fear was beginning to feel worse than any potential answer. Grabbing a dusty flashlight from the storeroom, I made my way to the old staircase at the back of the building. A thick chain and padlock usually barred entry to the second floor, but that night the lock was undone. There was no sign that anyone else had been up there. The old metal handle felt cold to my touch, and I hesitated before turning the knob, noticing how my hand trembled. My breath came in ragged gasps, and each inhalation seemed louder than it had any right to be. I pushed open the door, shining the flashlight beam into the dusty corridor. The air smelled of mold and stale wood, like a place long forgotten. My stomach twisted in knots as I took a few cautious steps forward. The floor groaned beneath me in eerie sympathy, each groan echoing in the hollow corridor. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the narrow beam of light, making the place feel unreal, as though I had stepped into a memory rather than a physical space. I scanned the area and noticed footprints in the dust. They were faint, but unmistakable, leading away from the door and deeper into the hallway. My pulse hammered against my ribs. The footprints looked fresh, as if someone had walked there just moments before I arrived. Yet the pattern was strange. The steps seemed evenly spaced, neither large nor small, belonging to no one I could clearly imagine. It was as if someone had glided along the corridor, leaving perfect impressions in the thick layer of dust. Swallowing hard, I followed them. They led me toward a room at the far end. The silence was agonizing except for the pounding of my heart. My skin prickled with each step. When I finally reached that room, its door was ajar. I aimed the flashlight inside, half expecting to see a figure lurking, but the space was empty. just an old storeroom with shelves and crates, all blanketed in dust and decay. There was no sign of anyone or anything. I felt an intense drop of tension, like the moment after a thunderclap, when you realize the sky has not yet fallen. I stood there for what felt like minutes, scanning every corner of that musty room. Nothing stirred, no piece of furniture seemed disturbed. My palms were slick with sweat, and my legs felt weak. The only sound was the slight ringing in my ears, punctuated by my sharp breaths. Eventually, I turned back toward the corridor. That was when the real shock hit me. The footprints were gone. I distinctly recall the wave of numbness washing through me as I stared at the undisturbed dust stretching along the corridor. No footprints led back to the door, no sign that anyone had walked there at all. My mind reeled with possibilities. Had my eyes betrayed me? Was I losing it, seeing footprints that never existed? My mouth went dry, my tongue heavy and useless. In a burst of panic, I rushed back down the hall to the staircase, practically bounding down 2 steps at a time. My chest tightened, and I could barely catch my breath. Once I reached the ground floor, I locked the door behind me and fastened the chain as tight as I could, as though that could keep whatever was there from following me. The entire experience left me shaking. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could hardly think. I turned off every light, locked the restaurant's main entrance, and hurried into the street, feeling as though I were being watched the whole way home. The next day, I confided in my coworker about what I'd seen. She looked at me with genuine concern. She said she had never gone up there herself, but others claimed they felt a presence, maybe even glimpsed shadows moving along the windows. In her recounting, no one had ever explained it in a satisfying way. Some believed it was the spirit of an old caretaker who once kept watch over the warehouse. Others speculated it was some kind of echo from the building's past, an imprint left behind by the restless energies of all who had toiled there. She recommended I avoid going up there again for my own peace of mind. I tried to rationalize everything. My job was important to me, and the last thing I needed was to dread coming in every evening. For a few weeks, I avoided staying late. When a late shift was inevitable, I did my best to finalize the register while other staff members were still around. Sometimes that meant rushing through tasks, but it was worth it to avoid being alone in that oppressive silence. Yet I could never fully escape the thought of those phantom footsteps overhead, or the disconcerting memory of footprints that disappeared without explanation. Over time, smaller incidents began to erode my sense of reality. Lights would flicker at odd moments, only to return to normal once I paid them close attention. Occasionally, I felt a surge of cold air brush past me when there was no draft. My reflection in the mirror behind the bar seemed at times slightly off, as though someone or something were hovering just out of sight. My paranoia grew, and I started doubting my own senses. I told myself I was sleep-deprived or stressed, but the doubt chipped away at my composure. One evening, as I was cleaning glasses, I detected movement in my peripheral vision. The restaurant was nearly empty. In the back corner, I saw a blurred figure sliding past the wall, heading toward the stairs. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I dropped the glass I was drying, my hands shaking uncontrollably. By the time I picked up the pieces of shattered crystal and found the courage to look again, there was nothing there. I told myself it was a trick of the light or a reflection from the bar's mirror, but my heart hammered so violently it made my chest ache. Even the customers who lingered late started mentioning odd noises from the upper floor. They would ask if we had a tenant upstairs, or if there was some storage area under renovation. Their observations made my nerves tighten like a coiled spring. I assured them it was just the old bones of the building settling, or the wind shifting against the rafters. But I felt my voice quaver with each excuse. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. I felt it was better to confront the fear than live under its looming shadow. On another late night, I found myself alone again. No matter how hard I tried, some nights it was inevitable. The building was dark, and the hush of the rooms made my ears ring. The second I heard those steps above, my skin flushed ice cold. But I was done running. I grabbed the flashlight once more, marched to that back staircase, and saw the chain still in place. This time, I didn't find the padlock undone. Instead, I had the key in my pocket. Management kept one in the office for emergencies, and I had borrowed it earlier with the excuse I needed to retrieve some old bar equipment. I unlocked the chain, took a deep breath, and threw open the door. My hands trembled, and sweat trickled down my temples. The corridor stretched before me in an impenetrable gloom, thick with dust and the scent of rot. I took slow, deliberate steps, shining my flashlight side to side, half expecting to see those footprints again. The hallway was silent, but the oppressive sense of being watched felt stronger than ever. My heart thumped so hard it felt like a drumbeat in my chest. My breath came in quick, shallow rasps, and then I heard it, a single footstep behind me, slow and unhurried. My body tensed with such force that pain shot through my neck. I whirled around but saw nothing, just the darkness and the dancing dust motes illuminated in my flashlight's beam. I called out, or tried to, but my voice cracked and died in my throat. I felt a crawling sensation on my skin, a near certainty that something was standing within arm's reach, just out of sight. My mind spun wildly, fighting to grasp an explanation. Was I hallucinating? Had the tension finally broken me? Desperate for answers, I pushed forward, deeper into the corridor. My steps resonated through the old timbers. I reached that storeroom at the end, the same one where the footprints had led me before. The door was closed this time. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out rational thought. My flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls, and for a split second, I thought I saw a faint silhouette standing in the gloom. It vanished as the light steadied. I pressed my hand to the door and felt a subtle vibration, as if there was something alive on the other side. Gathering what little courage remained, I pushed it open. The darkness inside was almost suffocating. My flashlight beam revealed the same dusty boxes, shelves covered in cobwebs, and a window at the far end with cracked panes. Nothing appeared amiss, yet every instinct screamed that I was not alone. A gust of cold air rushed past me, making me stagger back. It felt like a presence brushing against my side. My teeth chattered from a chill that penetrated straight to my bones. I forced myself to scan the room one more time, but there was no physical manifestation of anyone. And yet, that oppressive aura pressed in on me. My eyes prickled with tears of frustration and fear. I had no idea what to do, how to confront something that had no shape, no clear intention. I backed out of the room, never taking my eyes off the darkness inside. Step by step, I retreated, breath hitching in my throat. Then I turned, sprinting back down the corridor, nearly twisting my ankle on a loose board. The second I reached the staircase, I fumbled with the chain and padlock, hands shaking so badly that it took me multiple tries to lock the door. My lungs burned from lack of oxygen, as if I had been holding my breath the whole time. Outside in the main dining area, I leaned against the bar, trying to steady my breathing. My heart pounded so violently, it felt like it might burst through my chest. My clothes clung to me, soaked with sweat. Every part of me trembled, and I realized my nails had cut into my palms from the tension. Even though I was on the lower floor now, I had the unmistakable sensation that someone, or something, was standing just above me, peering through the floorboards with a silent, relentless gaze. That night, I left the restaurant in a daze, locking everything behind me with trembling hands. I spent hours awake in my apartment, replaying the events in my mind. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more my sanity seemed to fray. Some things defy explanation, lingering at the edge of our understanding. Perhaps it was a restless spirit, an echo of the building's past, or something else entirely. All I know is that I still work there, carefully planning my shifts to avoid late nights. But sometimes I have no choice. When the clock ticks past closing time and everyone else leaves, I feel my stomach twist into knots. I hear that first ominous step above me and feel the oppressive weight of the second floor overhead. My heart speeds up, my skin turns clammy, and I double-check that the chain on the upstairs door is secured. Yet even then, I sense that the presence isn't confined by any lock or barrier. I've found a kind of uneasy truce with my own fear. If I work fast enough, I can sometimes beat the feeling. I'll toss the night's receipts into the office safe, wipe down the bar, and practically fly out the door, never looking up at the ceiling where the boards occasionally creak of their own volition. But when I can't manage to leave in time, I sit at the bar, trying not to move, straining to hear every little noise. My heart races, my body trembles, and I can almost feel the presence above me, silent and unyielding, waiting for a moment of weakness. I don't know what it is. I don't know why it's there. I only know that a lingering question remains. Is it real, or is it some manifestation of my own paranoia? I question my senses, my sanity, my interpretation of every footstep and every sway of shadow. And in that questioning, I found a fear deeper than any ghost story. The realization that the mind can blur the line between what is tangible and what is imagined. In the end, the real horror might be the uncertainty. That uncertainty follows me every time I step into the old restaurant. And each night I lock up, I'm never entirely sure what waits above. Sometimes I swear I feel an unseen gaze tracking me as I move about the silent dining room. As I flip off the lights, my spine tingles. The absence of human voices only amplifies the building's voice. Groaning floors, rattling pipes, faint whispers in the wood. My palms sweat, and I catch myself breathing too fast. I force calm into my actions, but deep inside I remain on edge, alert and tense. In this place of echoing footsteps, vanished footprints, and elusive shapes in the darkness, I have found no comfort. But I have found a grudging acceptance that not all things in this world are meant to be understood. And with that acceptance comes a tentative peace, though it is fragile. Each night I tell myself that if I run into something beyond comprehension, I will simply walk away. I will lock the door behind me and leave it all in the silence of that second floor. But the truth is, even if I manage to escape the building, the memory, and the haunting possibility of what lurks upstairs comes home with me, embedded in my thoughts, refusing to let me go. It leaves a gnawing dread that stains my everyday life, a perpetual cold spot in my mind. And that, for me, is the real terror, the knowledge that some questions remain unanswered, that sometimes the darkness upstairs is more than just an empty room. It breathes, it watches, and one day, it might demand a confrontation I may not be ready to face. Until then, I do what I can. Finish my shift as quickly as possible, lock the doors, and hope that the presence remains content to roam the old floorboards above, leaving me with only the echo of footsteps and the unsettling chill that never quite fades. And the air felt wrong from the very first day I set foot in that house. There was a heaviness that made my skin prickle, as if the walls themselves exhaled an ancient, weary breath. My two roommates said they noticed nothing out of the ordinary, yet I sensed it in every echo of the wood floors and every draft that whispered through the dusty corridors. I did not know then how deeply that unseen presence would burrow into my thoughts, distorting my perception and prowling my mind at the loneliest hours of the night. I moved in with two college friends, let's call them Robert and Vincent, because the price was surprisingly affordable for such a large, old-fashioned house. It had tall ceilings, narrow hallways, and a basement that, according to the landlord, had once been rented out as a separate living space. At first, the three of us laughed at the idea of anyone choosing to live in a cramped, lightless basement. It seemed like a relic from another era, with a single wooden door at the top of creaking steps. None of us had much interest in exploring it beyond a cursory glance when we first toured the place. It smelled of stale air and rotting wood. The corners were stacked with broken furniture and mildew-spotted cardboard boxes. We agreed it was best to keep the door locked, so we wouldn't have to deal with unwelcome pests or the musty odor wafting into the rest of the house. In the weeks that followed, I tried to settle into a comfortable routine. I had a small bedroom on the second floor where the floorboards groaned under my weight, and the overhead light flickered erratically if I turned it on for more than a few minutes. Despite these minor inconveniences, I felt relatively at ease. However, that easy feeling faded one late afternoon when I found myself alone in the house, reading an article on my laptop. A sudden hush enveloped the place. I had been accustomed to Robert's music or Vincent's footsteps, but neither of them was home. With the absence of usual noise, I became hyper-aware of the faintest sounds. For a while, I heard only the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Then, something else. At first, it was so quiet I was not sure it was real. It reminded me of the muffled murmur someone makes when they are talking to themselves in another room. I paused, straining my ears. The tone was low and indecipherable, like a conversation behind a thick wall. The hair on my arms rose as I realized the sound originated from below, near the far side of the hallway, exactly where the door to the basement stood locked. My heart thumped against my rib cage. I told myself it was nothing more than the old house's plumbing or the wind slipping through gaps in the foundation. Yet, the murmuring persisted, rising and falling in an unnerving pattern, as though someone was reciting fragments of speech. I walked to the top of the basement stairs. The door was closed, but my skin tightened with the unmistakable sensation of an unseen presence beyond it. Then I grasped the doorknob. It turned, but only partially. The door seemed stuck, locked from the inside. Confusion surged through me. There was no lock on the inside as far as I remembered. With my pulse hammering, I put my shoulder against the wood, giving it a firm shove. On the second try, the door burst open with a crack, sending a cloud of dust floating through the air. The basement was dark, the single overhead bulb barely illuminating the space. I took a tentative step down, my heart drumming a furious rhythm. A pungent mix of mold and something sweet, like old perfume, assaulted my nose. I flicked on the bulb, half expecting to see someone crouched behind the scattered furniture. Instead, the place was empty, silent, and claustrophobic. Broken chairs leaned against the walls, and a moth-eaten sofa was pushed into a corner. No footprints or other signs of intrusion. I listened for movement, but heard nothing. My breathing came fast. Each exhalation echoed in the confined darkness. Dismissing the incident as some quirk of the house felt impossible, but I had no logical explanation. By the time Robert and Vincent returned, I was upstairs again, the basement door securely locked. When they found me in the kitchen, they both gave me inquisitive looks, seeing how pale and uneasy I appeared. I told them about the strange noise, the locked door, and my suspicion that someone might be sneaking in. Robert frowned, suggesting it might be a trick of acoustics. Vincent speculated maybe a homeless person had a copy of an old key. Neither seemed too convinced by their own theories, but both insisted they had not gone downstairs. Vincent then confided something I had not known. According to the landlord, that basement had been inhabited by an older tenant who liked to keep to himself and rarely interacted with anyone. Nobody seemed to remember exactly when he left or why. Over the following days, the murmur occasionally returned. It was never clear or loud enough for me to make out words. More disturbing than the murmur was a recurring scent, a stale cologne underscored by the tang of mold. It came in brief waves, lingering around the stairwell near the basement door. Each time I detected it, my chest constricted with a sense of foreboding. I would press my ear to the door, half expecting to hear that same low voice. Sometimes I thought I heard soft footsteps pacing back and forth. Other times there was only emptiness. Sleep became elusive. I lay awake at night, thoughts swirling with irrational fears. Despite my attempts at rationalizing what was happening, I couldn't shake the growing anxiety gnawing at my stomach. My friends seemed increasingly concerned about my well-being. On one occasion, Robert implied I might be letting stress get the better of me, and Vincent tried to reassure me that old houses have their share of unexplained noises. I tried to laugh it off, but I felt a new sense of isolation, as though the shadows in the corners of that house were watching me, studying me. My heart rate quickened each time I passed the closed basement door. Then the nightmares began. In my dream, I stood at the top of the basement stairs. A voice below called my name repeatedly in a low chant. The door refused to budge, but the chanting grew louder until it vibrated through my bones. I woke drenched in sweat, sheets twisted around my legs. My chest felt tight, and my mouth was dry as though I had been screaming. The worst part was how tangible it all seemed. Even hours after sunrise, the memory of that dream made my palms clammy. One Saturday evening, I was alone again in the house. Robert and Vincent had gone to a party, but I opted to stay behind due to a lingering sense of fatigue that had followed me all day. Shortly after dusk, I heard those telltale footsteps below the floorboards. They seemed to circle the basement, then stopped directly beneath my position in the living room. A soft tapping echoed upward, almost like a fingernail against the underside of the floor. With trembling hands, I turned off the television and tried to calm my breath. My heart pounded in my ears, and a cold sweat beaded along my forehead. I decided I had to confront this. Irrational or not, I needed to see if someone, was down there. The hallway stretched out before me like a tunnel, the only source of light being a small lamp near the front door. The basement door stood at the far end, an imposing barrier that both repelled and lured me. Each step felt heavier than the last. A hush had fallen over the entire house, so intense that my ears hummed in the silence. When I reached for the doorknob, my pulse thudded so loudly I could feel it in my temples. It was locked, just as I had left it. Gathering courage, I inserted the key, but the moment I turned it, a dull thump came from the other side. It was as if someone had pressed their hand against the door. The short hairs on the back of my neck stood up. For a heartbeat, I froze, unsure if I should continue. Then I swallowed hard, forced myself to open the door, and flicked on the basement light. The stairs lay below, steep and shadowed. The air felt thick, weighing me down. As I descended, each step let out a plaintive creak. My throat constricted, and my breathing became ragged. Once I reached the concrete floor, I surveyed the space. Nothing had changed. Dilapidated furniture along the walls, the same musty odor clinging to every surface. Except this time, as I moved farther in, I noticed a small object near the base of an old bookcase. Stooping down, I realized it was a photograph in a battered frame. The image was faded and water-stained, showing a man seated in what appeared to be that very basement. He wore a formal suit, and in his right hand he held a single key. The expression on his face seemed strangely vacant, but his posture radiated a quiet, unsettling confidence. I examined the edges, noticing some scribbled initials on the back that I couldn't decipher. A wave of cold pulsed through me, as if I had touched a block of ice. I returned the photograph to its dusty perch and felt the hair on my arm stand on end. The faint scent of that same stale cologne curled in the air, tinged with mold. I sensed an electric tension, a static charge that made my skin crawl. Bile rose in my throat as the corners of the basement seemed to press inward. My head spun, and for a moment, the lights overhead flickered, casting the furniture in a bizarre dance of shadows. My heart hammered to the point that I feared it might burst. Then the bulb steadied, and the basement returned to its previous gloom. I decided I had seen enough, if not too much. My exit was swift. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. Over the next few days, the situation only grew more disturbing. Whenever I tried to focus on my studies or watch television, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes darting past corners or gliding silently behind pieces of furniture. My sense of time blurred. Sometimes I would look at the clock and swear only a few minutes had passed, but the display showed an hour's difference. My heart would race unexpectedly, as though anticipating some unseen threat. I became paranoid, jumping at any sound. Each night the nightmares returned, filled with dark corridors and that insistent chanting, always too soft to be comprehensible but intense enough to rob me of peace. One afternoon, Robert and Vincent noticed I was pale and visibly trembling, so they tried to intervene. They asked if I wanted to move out, or if I believed we should call someone to check the basement for structural issues. I recalled them mentioning something about a possible leak or mold. Neither had heard the murmurs as clearly as I had, but they admitted they sometimes caught whiffs of that eerie, old-fashioned cologne. Both insisted we should investigate more thoroughly during the day, with better light, and possibly contact the landlord. I said that was a good idea. though a tangled knot of anxiety still clenched in my chest. We set aside a morning to search the basement together. I felt faintly relieved, thinking having them both alongside me would keep my imagination from spiraling out of control. The three of us descended with flashlights and methodically checked every corner, every piece of worn-out furniture. The entire time, I struggled against an irrational urge to scream, my sweat-soaked palms slippery against the flashlight's grip. My mouth went dry, and my heart thudded in my ears. Yet, despite our thorough search, we uncovered nothing unusual. Aside from dust, cobwebs, and that single photo I had found, there was no sign of hidden passages, no footprints, no personal belongings. We decided the photograph must have been left behind by the previous tenant. Robert and Vincent seemed somewhat reassured by the lack of overt evidence, but I could not banish the feeling that the basement itself was watching us, like a sleeping beast awaiting nightfall to stir. In the days that followed, the activity intensified. I heard furniture shifting in the basement late at night, followed by a dragging sound that halted abruptly. My bedroom door occasionally rattled as though someone was testing the knob from the outside. When I shot out of bed to check, the hallway was empty. The sense of intrusion became unbearable, making me question my own mental stability. Sometimes, I even wondered if I was hallucinating. My appetite diminished, and whenever I did manage to sleep, I woke up drenched in sweat, my body trembling. The tension in my stomach rarely went away. Finally, one night, I snapped awake from yet another nightmare. The entire house was silent except for my own ragged breathing. My heart raced. Anxiety radiated down my arms, making my fingers tingle. I had to know if I was truly losing my mind or if something else was at work. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept downstairs in the darkness, my flashlight cutting a weak path through the gloom. The hallway stretched out, eerily still. I stood before the basement door, that stale perfume swirling around me in faint gusts. My muscles tensed, but something in me refused to back away. With shaky hands, I unlocked the door and stepped onto the top stair. This time, I did not turn on the light. I descended slowly into darkness, each step bringing a surge of fear that made me want to retreat. Yet I pressed on. At the bottom, I paused, listening. My heart pounded furiously as the silence pressed on my eardrums. Then came a whisper, a ragged exhalation so close that it may as well have been by my ear. My veins turned to ice, and I shone the flashlight around wildly. The beam revealed nothing. No shape, no figure. Just the same neglected furniture and the same battered walls. But the presence was there, suffocating and charged. The faintest outline shifted in my peripheral vision, vanishing the instant I tried to focus on it. Then, in a rush of adrenaline, I felt something brush lightly against my arm, like the trailing edge of a sleeve passing me by. My legs nearly gave out from under me as I spun around, shining the flashlight in a panic. I saw only dusty shadows. My breath came in ragged bursts, and I felt tears of terror welling up. I forced my feet to move, stumbling up the stairs with each muscle coiled in dread. When I reached the hallway, I locked the door behind me once more, my body drenched in sweat. My heart thumped so hard it made my chest ache. I bolted upstairs to my room, feeling as if the walls were closing in around me. The next morning, I announced to my roommates that I was done. I could not continue living beneath the weight of a haunting presence that defied explanation. I told them I didn't care what they chose to do, but I needed to leave, to get far away from that basement. They understood the raw terror in my expression. None of us could deny that the house felt stifling, filled with a tension that threatened to snap at any moment. Within a week, I had arranged to move into a small apartment across town. Packing was difficult because I refused to go near the basement again, but I had little stored down there anyway. Each night leading up to my departure, I heard those faint, unsettling footsteps drifting through the floorboards, as if the presence below roamed restlessly, aware that I was fleeing. I slept with my lights on, bracing for any sudden sound or movement. On my final morning in that house, I stood at the threshold with the last box in my arms. The entire place felt oddly silent, as if the walls were holding their breath. When Robert asked if I wanted to say goodbye to the basement or check it one more time, I simply shook my head. I recalled the ghostly hand that had brushed against me in the dark, and the whispered murmur that refused to leave my memory. No good could come from stepping down there again. As I turned away, the faintest trace of that stale cologne drifted past my nose. My heart gave a lurch, and a cold sweat gathered on my brow. Yet this time, I did not linger. I left the key behind on the kitchen table. The house seemed to watch me depart with a silent, heavy gaze. Even now, in my new apartment, I find myself listening for footsteps at odd times, half expecting to catch the scent of that old perfume. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I dream of descending those rickety stairs into the basement's gloom, only to find a figure waiting there, a man with vacant eyes, holding the same key I once turned. I always wake with my heart hammering and the sheets drenched in cold sweat. My chest tightens at the memory, and my stomach churns with a nameless dread. People often ask why I left that spacious old house behind, but I usually give them a vague explanation about mold issues and leaky pipes. I know they would not understand the truth, or they might dismiss it as the ramblings of an overworked mind. But I cannot forget those murmurs, that locked door that made no sense, or the intangible presence that brushed against me. The house remains there, silent in the daylight, but I am sure the basement stirs once darkness falls, filling the halls with muffled voices no one can decipher. And though I have escaped its walls, the memory still lingers like a cold shadow, reminding me that some doors, once opened, leave more than dust and mold behind. The echo of that presence remains, haunting the corners of my mind and reminding me that there are places best left undisturbed. I still remember the stale smell of that hallway, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the cracked linoleum floor. Even at midday, it felt like twilight inside that building. Something about the chipped paint on the walls and the faint clanging of old plumbing put me on edge from the moment I first walked in. That should have been my warning, yet I brushed it aside, eager to expand my small design business. I had no idea how drastically my life would change once I stepped inside that elevator alone, night after night. I rented the commercial space on the 5th floor of an old building constructed in the 1970s. The owner claimed it had been well maintained, but the chipped tiles, dim corridors, and buzzing overhead lights told me otherwise. Despite its flaws, the rent was affordable, and the location was close to downtown. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to move my design studio out of my cramped apartment and into a more professional setting. On my first visit, I noticed how the elevator doors groaned when they opened, almost as if protesting against the effort. The panel inside was old-fashioned, worn buttons with a faintly illuminated panel above them. A row of numbers signifying each floor glowed in murky shades of orange. The caretaker, a wiry man who scurried around the lobby with a tool belt, had insisted everything worked properly. He shrugged while mentioning some electrical quirks, but I assumed it was nothing beyond a relic of outdated wiring. At first, my experiences were mundane. I arrived in the morning, took the elevator to the 5th floor, unlocked my studio, and began work. During the day, the building filled with the quiet hum of other businesses, muffled conversations in the hallway, the rush of foot traffic in the lobby, and the occasional ringing phone. The elevator's mechanical whine became part of the background noise. I told myself it added a bit of character to the place. Trouble began when my workload forced me to stay late. I would lose track of time, deeply focused on editing an ad campaign or finalizing logo concepts. By the time I looked up, the sun had long since gone down. The building's interior changed at night. Most tenants left by 6 or 7, and once they disappeared, the silence turned oppressive. I could hear every rattle of the pipes, every click of the cooling system, and the ominous hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. On one of those late nights, I was packing up my laptop when I heard a muffled clang in the hallway. It was soft, but clear enough to make me stop. My heart gave a sharp thud. The caretaker normally went home around 5, so I had no logical explanation for that sound. Nonetheless, I told myself it must have been the elevator's old machinery shifting. Determined not to let my imagination run wild, I headed out, locked my door, and pressed the call button for the elevator. When the door slid open, the interior was empty, as expected. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. The overhead light blinked once, like a flickering candle. My stomach twisted in that split second of darkness, and I felt my pulse speed up. Then the light returned, stable but dim, and the doors closed with a metallic thud. I chalked it up to old wiring again, exhaling slowly as I waited to descend. The elevator moved without incident that evening, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few nights later, around 9 o'clock, I heard the elevator arrive on my floor without me having called it. I'd been in my studio, cleaning up coffee cups and organizing files. The ding of the elevator bell echoed in the silent hallway. I peered out of my office, expecting to see someone stepping out, maybe a tenant working late. But the corridor remained empty. The elevator doors had opened, letting out a square of pale light. Then, just as I walked closer, they slid shut again, and the elevator descended, leaving me alone in the suddenly too quiet hallway. That was only the beginning. The phenomenon repeated itself on several occasions. I would be finishing up. Sometimes it was 8 at night, sometimes 10, and I'd hear the elevator come to a halt on my floor. The doors would open to reveal an empty cab, as though waiting for a passenger no one else could see. The first few times I stepped closer to investigate, but I always felt a cold prickle along my arms, a sense of being watched. I felt silly for hesitating at the threshold of an ordinary elevator, yet something in the back of my mind warned me not to step inside unless I had to. Eventually, necessity won over caution. One night, I had no choice but to go down. I finished a major project that was due early the following morning, and the only way out was either the elevator or 5 flights of a claustrophobic stairwell that smelled of mold. I told myself I was being irrational. So, I took a deep breath and stepped into the waiting cabin. Inside, my fingers felt sweaty against the cracked plastic of the ground floor button. My heart hammered as I pressed it, but nothing happened. The panel of numbers flickered erratically. I tried pressing the button again. Then the door opened control. The overhead light dimmed as if it were gasping for power, then came back full force. The doors slid shut with a sudden finality that made my stomach jolt. I felt gravity shift beneath my feet, as though the elevator had begun its descent. Yet the panel showed no corresponding floor numbers. Seconds ticked by. My breathing quickened, and an uncomfortable pressure built in my chest. Finally, the panel's lights flashed, settling on a faint B I assumed stood for the basement or sub-basement. The ride ended abruptly, and the elevator halted with a jarring thump. The lights inside flickered out, plunging me into absolute darkness. My throat went dry as I fumbled for the emergency button. I couldn't see an inch in front of my face, and my breath sounded unnaturally loud in the confined space. Then, as suddenly as they had failed, the lights returned. My eyes stung from the abrupt shift. I forced myself to look around, half expecting the doors to open into some pitch-black corridor, but they remained closed. In that moment, my ears caught a faint static noise, like a distant whisper trapped in the vents. My heart pounded so violently I almost thought I could hear it echo back. Then, with no input from me, the elevator jolted upward, shooting back up to the 5th floor. The doors opened onto the exact same hallway I'd left, as if no time had passed. I stumbled out, perspiration beading on my forehead. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself, my legs tingling with pins and needles. When I looked back, the elevator was empty and still, like a gaping metal mouth waiting for its next victim. That incident made me swear to avoid late nights. For weeks I came in early and left before dark. My paranoia skyrocketed. Every time I heard the elevator's heavy groan, I tensed. I started noticing other unsettling details around the building. The air in the 5th floor corridor often felt colder than in the lobby, despite the same heating system supposedly servicing all floors. Strange stains marred the wallpaper, a rust-colored mark near the elevator doors. A faint odor of damp concrete lingered in the stairwell. I tried to rationalize everything. Old building, poor maintenance, maybe a minor leak somewhere. But it never truly eased my mind. There were days I thought about moving out, but money was tight, and breaking the lease wasn't an option. Instead, I tried focusing on my work, hoping my imagination was playing tricks on me. But it never stopped. I started having vivid nightmares about the elevator doors snapping shut on me, while a silent figure stood in the corner. I would awaken, heart pounding, drenched in cold sweat, and the first thought in my mind would be that sub-basement level. I tried discussing the matter with a neighbor on the 4th floor. He was a reclusive accountant who rarely looked up from the folders he carried. One morning, I caught him in the hallway and brought up my odd experiences. He barely paused, muttering that he'd also heard strange things at night, clattering pipes, doors opening on their own, but he avoided making eye contact. I sensed he knew more than he let on, but preferred not to get involved. His reaction left me feeling even more isolated. Eventually, the cycle of bizarre events resumed. My business picked up, new contracts poured in, and deadlines forced me to stay longer. This time, whenever I heard the elevator ding past 8 o'clock, a chill crept along my spine. On one particularly frantic evening, I found myself working until almost midnight. I hadn't planned it, but an urgent client request demanded my immediate attention. My eyes were burning from staring at the screen, and the stillness of the building became tangible. Every now and then, the radiators hissed, making me flinch. Stepping out of my office, I braced for the uneasy feeling that always accompanied me to the elevator bank. Sure enough, as I reached the worn call button, the elevator arrived on my floor of its own accord. The door slid open, revealing an empty compartment. My throat felt tight, my tongue suddenly dry. It reminded me of that night I got trapped and taken down to the sub-basement. I told myself I had to remain calm. I glanced at the stairwell, but the thought of navigating 5 flights of foul-smelling stairs in near darkness felt equally unnerving. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the elevator. I placed my palm on the ground floor button, almost expecting resistance. To my surprise, it illuminated promptly, and the doors closed smoothly. For a moment, I felt relief. Perhaps it was just an old, finicky system, and that previous event had been a fluke. But 2 floors down, the elevator lurched to a stop. The lights overhead buzzed, growing dim. The doors opened onto the 3rd floor corridor. No one stood outside, yet I felt a presence. My skin broke out in goosebumps, and the hair on the back of my neck rose. I fought the urge to hold my breath, convinced there was something unseen just beyond my line of sight. Seconds ticked by in eerie silence, the elevator doors remaining open as though waiting for an invisible passenger. I couldn't handle it. My heart slammed against my ribcage, so I tapped the door close button repeatedly. The door slid shut at last, and the elevator resumed its descent. It happened again on the 2nd floor, then the 1st, each time opening onto an empty corridor, each time lingering too long. My face felt hot, despite the cold sweat drenching my back. It was as if something wanted to enter or exit, and was checking each floor in search of what? When the cab finally reached the lobby, my lungs released the air I hadn't realized I was holding. I rushed out, ignoring the quizzical look from the security guard at the desk. He didn't ask me anything, but his gaze followed me as I hurried across the worn marble tiles and out of the building. Once outside, I breathed in the cool night air, struggling to clear my head of the claustrophobic memories. Over the next few days, I began to question my own sanity. Had I become so paranoid that I was hallucinating these events? I was working under significant stress, rarely sleeping enough. Perhaps it was all in my mind. Yet, each time I set foot in that lobby, the memory of that basement level and the elevator's ghostly stops returned in vivid detail. My pulse would quicken, and I would fight a near overpowering urge to flee. The final straw came on a stormy evening, when thunder rumbled through the city streets, and lightning illuminated the cracked facade of the building. I was finishing a complex layout for a client brochure, trying to drown out my anxiety with music from my headphones. Rain lashed the windows, and the wind whistled through the aging seals. I had no idea how late it was until my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. It was nearing 11 o'clock. My muscles tensed. I immediately began packing up, determined not to deal with that elevator again in the middle of the night. As I stepped into the hallway, a sharp flicker overhead made the lights blink. The corridor dimmed for an instant, and I heard a low groan from the elevator shaft. My pulse raced. I pressed the elevator call button but simultaneously glanced at the stairwell, torn between two dreadful choices. The ring of the elevator bell startled me. The doors opened as if beckoning me. The overhead light inside that cab was weaker than usual, flickering in a pattern that set my nerves on edge. I decided in that moment I would not ride it. Fear clawed at my insides, and I chose the stairwell. My steps echoed in the concrete shaft, each footfall accompanied by the relentless drip of water somewhere behind the walls. About halfway down, I froze. Above me, I heard the elevator whir into motion, descending in parallel. I swear I heard it stopping at each landing, opening its doors with that familiar clang. Yet I was the only person in the building, at least as far as I could tell. Each time I reached a new level, I paused to see if the elevator was there, but I only saw closed doors. My stomach twisted as the sense of being followed intensified. That feeling of a presence overshadowed every step, my heart thudding in raw panic. Finally, after what felt like an endless descent, I burst into the lobby. My breath came in ragged gulps. The security desk was vacant. Perhaps the guard had gone on a break. Only the empty, soul-sucking quiet of the lobby greeted me. I glanced over at the elevator. Its doors were ajar, light flickering inside. I didn't wait to see if they would close. I rushed out into the rain, letting the storm soak me. I remember feeling relief, but also a persistent dread, as though an unseen stare followed me out onto the street. The next day, I approached the building's owner and announced I intended to move out. Despite the inconvenience, I couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that had taken hold of me. As I packed up my studio for the last time, I felt an odd mixture of shame and relief. My hands shook while putting my sketches and computer equipment into boxes, and I couldn't help scanning the corridor to ensure I was alone. I managed to finish before sundown, refusing to face another night of those mysterious stops and flickering lights. Even now, months later, I still get chills when I think about that elevator. I haven't told many people about my experiences, afraid they'll dismiss me as hysterical or overly tired. Sometimes, in the quiet of my new office, I hear a phantom echo of sliding doors and that distant clang. My heartbeat spikes, and I almost expect to see those worn buttons glowing in the darkness. In those moments, I remember the suffocating tension in the elevator car and the unsettling feeling that someone, or something, was operating it from the other side. I can't definitively say what was in control of that ancient mechanism. Maybe it was a haunting, or maybe it was a product of my overworked mind. But the fear was real, down to every drop of sweat and every thump of my pulse. Whenever I pass by a building that looks stuck in a bygone era, I find myself avoiding the entrance. My breathing quickens just a bit, and a surge of adrenaline floods my system as I recall those empty hallways and the hum of that defective fluorescent light. I left that building behind, yet the unease it spawned in me clings on like a shadow that refuses to fade. Sometimes I wonder if the elevator still runs late into the night, opening its doors on deserted floors and waiting for a passenger no one else can see. And I wonder if whoever steps inside it next will have the same luck I did in getting out.